then I can see some synergy between that and social networks.
No, it's I think, you know, as I mentioned when Lauren was talking about this project, I mean, I think that there's a lot of overlap between the work that you're doing and the work that I've done looking at homeless youth in care settings around, and this is something a little bit different that I mentioned when she was there. And most of the work that I've done is with homeless youth in the context of drop-in centers, so that's kind of as close to a care setting as most homeless youth are willing to engage in or can engage in sometimes, but we'll get into this more deeply, but you guys may actually have an opportunity to do some really interesting stuff with this data that you may not have thought about yet, because I think you're not just collecting egocentric social network data because of the fact that you're in a relatively enclosed space, and so there's an opportunity that you guys may not even be aware of, and I would definitely want to talk to you about it more, but I won't do that yet. But I think you have a gold mine that you're going to be sitting on top of in terms of understanding how the not just the individuals and the social networks that surround them, but sort of how this larger social context of these housing developments is actually maybe creating a structure that may be conducive or not to health behaviors. And I'm really interested in health behaviors as sort of the primary outcome that I tend to focus my work on. I mean, I'm really interested, my population is homeless youth, and I do definitely work around housing, but primarily the social network work that I do is around health outcomes, more so than housing outcomes, although housing outcomes are there too. So, I'm sorry, you came in late, and so I missed you in the clockwise arc. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and your interest in social network analysis, that would really help me out.
Yeah, sorry I was late. I'm Craig Holden.
You're Craig?
Yeah, Craig Holden. Yeah. So I'm a doctoral student. I was at this school when it used to be in a different building. So I'm in year about 115 of my doctoral studies. So I've never actually had a class in this building. But I'm interested in this because I'm also a policy fellow with the New York State Democrats. And I'm looking at Medicaid health homes. Basically, that's, for people who don't know, that there's about 1 million out of the 5 million Medicaid patients, and 1 million of them were identified with chronic conditions, specific chronic conditions that are costing the state a lot of money. But my interest isn't really from the state's point of view. It's just there's going to have to be a lot of changes in terms of the altering of multidisciplinary teams and coordination and collaboration, etc. Which all looks very good on paper, but it could be chaotic and incompetently done in actual implementation. So I had never really heard of this before the email was sent around, and then I started to look at it. I watched the video, I tried to inform myself about it, and it seems like some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of mapping things and actually getting to the core of where the relationships are and the connections could be very useful for what I'm trying to look at. So I think it could be very useful for what I'm trying to do.
Cool. Yeah, I have one of my doctoral students is interested in not so much medical health things, but she's interested in because she is also doing work around homelessness. So it's these integrated teams of care that they put around individuals at times. So it includes nurses and social workers and psychiatrists and and trying to understand how those teams function, and kind of mapping out those teams and that she's not, she's very early on she's still collecting the data, so we don't really know a lot about what's going on there quite yet, but I think that it could be very valuable to problematize what those structures look like, how those structures function. Because on some very simplistic level, it's like, well, everybody knows each other. But who cares? That's so transparent. It's more how is information actually flowing across? How are referrals actually happening? To what extent and how much are people really engaging with one another? She's really interested in these these peer outreach workers that are supposed to be a big part of these teams. And so the question is, you know, are these peer outreach workers potentially forming really important bridges between the clients and the rest of these providers, or are these peer outreach workers really just sort of tokens as a part of these teams, and they're really kind of just, you know, there because it sounds good on paper, but they're not really they're not really allowed to do much in practice. And so I think you know, some of these techniques could be useful for that. I think what you're thinking about is we haven't really figured out how to do that work very well yet. So she's kind of in this particular application in a little bit of uncharted territory, which is kind of a good place to be as a PhD student, but sometimes is a bit anxiety provoking as a PhD student. So
because you oversleep and things like that.
Yeah, you know, you kind of want, like, oh, I have a new topic that's a really important thing, but I've got well-worn methods that I can use to do it. Like, that feels very safe. It's always, you know, less safe feeling when you both have a new topic and new methods that need to be developed.
Yeah, definitely. The closest I got was I did sort of small literature review about how this has been used in healthcare and multidisciplinary systems and things like that. And there was a reasonable amount of it, but, you know, that's compared to zero. There was a reasonable amount compared to zero. There were about 48 studies that I found in one situation, but nothing as good as what you're describing, really.
Well, you know, you could be on the cutting edge of some stuff too.
Well,
so, thank you all for introducing me. I think yourselves to me. I think this will help me steer this talk a little bit. My intention, and I don't know how well this got communicated in the emails that were sent around. I saw some, but not all of them. But my thought was that for the first couple of hours this morning, I would go through somewhat of a formal presentation that I've done in a couple of other workshop settings. A few years ago, it's at the Society for Social Work Research, I did an hour and a half, sort of a rushed version of this talk. And then a couple of years ago at one of the California State Universities, I did a more expanded version of this talk. And I do an informal lab group with PhD students around these issues regularly, and I do a lot of independent studies around this stuff, although I don't teach a course in it. So I have a more formal presentation that I'll try to do in a relatively informal and interactive way. So please don't hesitate to stop me and ask me questions, because I really want this to be something useful to all of you. I think that one day is not going to be enough to get you maybe doing more than maybe writing one paper that you might send me some follow-up emails and say, am I doing this right? Does this look okay to you? But, you know, I'd be happy to be, you know, in contact with those things around you. But also just to kind of get you started on what's next, like where would you want to go next with this? And so along those lines, what I was thinking about was when we break for lunch, maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about which of these things seem interesting to you, given what you've told me about where your different projects are at. I think I have even some ideas about what might be useful to some of you moving forward, but I'd love more feedback about that so that I can steer the afternoon. It'll be a little bit more informal, and based on what you're interested in, I can kind of plow into some of those topics a little bit more deeply, or we can, you know, I can maybe even provide some consultation around particular projects if you're trying to develop those particular projects, and that may provide a good learning opportunity for other folks as, you know, as we're struggling with maybe your issues, that then we can say, okay, well, you know, that's going to provide people with a bit of context. And likewise, if you feel like after the morning you've kind of gotten what you want to get out of this, and it's a Friday and you're burnt, you know, like, and you want to sort of skip that sort of more informal part later on, you know, that's fine by me too. I certainly won't be offended. It's entirely, you know, to your discretion. But I'm yours for the day, so please take advantage, and also please don't hesitate to stop me. I really am not easily derailed. Well, I'm easily derailed into tangents, but that's probably a good thing, because likely it's a tangent that you want to know about, or else you wouldn't have asked me the question. But I'm not easily sort of unraveled, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So on the second slide on these handout, you can see these download links. And what I have here for these download links are the slides, so that you can have them if you want. The examples, so I've actually got a couple of different data sets, which I am sharing with you a few little snippets of data, so that if you want to download some of the free programs that are out there to do social network analysis, you can do that and play around with it. And I suppose that's another thing that we could even do later this afternoon, if that's where people's interests lie, is to actually, download some things onto your laptops, and we can kind of open up the data and muck around with it a little bit and get a chance to see, okay, how do you actually open up these files? How do you actually, load in data? Like, what if I wanted to make my own data set? How would I do that, Eric? Do all of that. And then the articles that I've got on this download link are a few things. So 2 of them are the articles that I sent to you ahead of time that are my articles. And then there's an article about network data collection methods that Peter Marsden wrote in 2005. So it's not, things advance in the last 10 years, but it's still a good, I think, starting point for how should one go about collecting network data. And I think for everyone in this room who's a kindred spirit of mine, who's interested in applied, real-world, social justice-driven, health-driven, improving the lives of disadvantaged populations sort of universe, collecting real-world data is not just a taken-for-granted thing, right? Like a lot of social network data was initially collected in very easy-to-work-in situations, like classrooms in high schools and things like this, where it's a sort of a captive audience, and it's very easy to ask them about who their friends are, or who they play on sports teams with, and all this other stuff that really probably we don't care about so much, and we deal with much more complicated populations and much less easily defined networks. And so data collection is not a simple thing, and I would certainly be happy to spend some time later this afternoon talking about my own experiences having collected many network data sets all in messy real-world situations, and how to do that, and what that's like. And I think that that's something that social work and public health, which sort of seems to encompass most everybody in this room, really can contribute to social network studies in some ways. And then the other things, a couple things that are in there, is there's the first couple chapters of the book by Wasserman and Faust, which is it's a book from 1994 that is about this thick, and it's super math heavy, and it's really kind of intimidating to people. But that said, the first 2 chapters are a brilliant introduction to social network analysis, and they make the assumption that you know absolutely nothing, and that your math skills might be pretty rusty, and so they don't get too deep into equations that they don't get anywhere into equations that they don't define very clearly within those first 2 chapters, and really provide sort of a nice overview. And so I give you that as well. So that's sort of what's in there, and there might be something else. Oh, and the last thing that's in there is an article by Milton Friedman, who is one of the real kind of godfathers of social network analysis in terms of the software technology aspects of looking at networks and visualizing them and mapping them out. And he has a nice, also very approachable article about how can you visualize networks, and how can you, and what are good techniques and thoughts about visualizing networks. And part of the other reason why I give you both this Wasserman and Faust book and this Freeman article is that at University of California at Irvine in the 90s, there was a group of social network researchers who all were there, and Wasserman and Faust and Freeman and this guy Steve Borgatti, the 4 of them were all at UC Irvine in the mid-90s, early mid-90s, and that sort of created a critical mass of network thinkers who were working together both in terms of developing software technologies and mathematical models, and trying to codify some of the things that had really emerged throughout the 70s and 80s primarily in sociology around social network analysis. And so that book and Freeman's article and the software UCINet and the software NetDraw that I'm going to be sharing with you today, which are freely available on the web, they all happen by the same guys, and they're all talking about things with the same language. And so that book, even though it's a real pain to get through at times, there's like a one-to-one correlation between the software and that book. And so it's a nice, even though it's not necessarily the most user-friendly thing in the world, the software is also kind of absent of documentation, and so you have to sort of be willing to fumble around a bit, and these books can help you kind of get through that. So I give you that warning and caveat. Yeah.
Just a quick question. How naive is it to use a questionnaire to assess social networks? Because you're talking about kind of complicated.
Not naive at all.
Okay.
And I think that critical. And I think I would love to spend some time talking with, if you guys have already written your questionnaire and it's too late, then that's fine. Maybe we can talk about how to use what you've got to do what you want. But if you haven't written your questionnaire yet, maybe then we can talk about what should be in that questionnaire. And I'm going to talk some this morning about some basic ideas about what need to be in that. So maybe as sort of an overview, I should throw this up. I'm going to talk about two classes of network analysis this morning. One is egocentric social network analysis, which is really you as a person and what's the constellation of people in your social universe that you're connected to, and that usually involves a multiplicity of ties. So for me, I have people that are part of my family. I have family network ties. I have work network ties. I have purely sort of socializing network ties. I have community organizations that I belong to. I have advisory boards that I'm a part of. There's this whole sort of, I've got many different kinds of ties that surround me. And so egocentric social network analysis is really interested in trying to understand the complexity of those universes that surround individual people. But in that case, you almost want to think about people as being like at the center of a star, where you are the center of your universe. We all are the centers of our own universes. But from an egocentric social network standpoint, it's a very accurate description of the way that we think about things. But what we don't know about much is how social networks intersect with one another. So I think in the mid-90s, when I was a PhD student at Stanford doing social network analysis, and I would say to people that I was doing social network research, they would look at me and say, well, what does that mean? And I would have to go through this long explanation. Well, you have these social ties to people, and we can think about them as, and try to articulate them and model them. And it was this really abstract thing. And nobody ever asks me that anymore, I think because of Facebook. So about 10 years ago, people started saying to me, like, oh, you mean like MySpace? And I would say, no, not MySpace, real social networks. And now nobody even asks me that question. They just sort of assume, of course, I'm talking about Facebook. And at this point, yes, I am talking about Facebook, because that's become, the sort of, and I think we live in this increasingly networked universe where we're much more self-conscious of those networks. And so that you have friends who have friends that aren't your friends, and you also know that you have mutual friends, and we're all very self-conscious of the way that our networks intersect, in part because we engage in this new form of communication that makes those things much more explicit. And so, but social network analysis, I think also from the egocentric social network analysis that used to be primarily what most social scientists thought about, also now inherently, intuitively feels very limited to us, because we're so aware of these expanses of ties. We're very aware of this Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram's like famous for two things, right? He's the guy who electric shocked people, and showed us that explained to us why the Nazis were able to take over Germany. And then he's also the guy who came up with the 6 degrees of separation idea. And I think that this idea of being 6 degrees of separation from sort of almost anyone else in the world, it's really, I don't know if you guys ever keep track of, but every once in a while Facebook will do a new analysis where they'll look at what is the 6 degrees of separation through Facebook, and they'll pick, they'll do the study where they pick random users of Facebook and see how many ties it takes to connect them, and it is about 6. Which, so he it's kind of funny that he came into this, and it's actually, what's also funny is that as the networks have existed for a longer period of time, you're actually seeing this slight shrinkage of that 6. Like the 6 is going, it hasn't left that range of 6 yet, but it's like, the decimal, as you go out a couple decimal places, it's getting smaller over time, which is also interesting to think about. So we're also going to talk about whole networks. So that's these, once you start to get into, not just your ties, but the indirect ties that you have to one another, and how those indirect ties may play out. And for all of these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some basic concepts, data collection techniques, which I think is really important for us doing applied work, and then visualizations. So how do we actually draw these things out, which is a really useful first step in social network analysis. I think I like to think of it as an analog to when you're doing statistical analysis, and the very first thing that you do is you start looking at your frequency distributions. You just sort of look at, what does my data look like? The visualizations really serve that purpose. And then the last thing is sort of statistical models. So within the context of social work and public health research, we're almost always interested in publishing in journals where they want to know, was that statistically significant, right? I mean, this is unfortunately, for better or for worse, this is the universe that we live in now. There's a lot of social network modeling that has nothing to do with statistical significance whatsoever. It's purely about different ways of conceptualizing networks, different ways of describing networks. But for us in the work that we do, those models are a little bit navel-gazing. They're a little bit, they don't necessarily elucidate, health outcomes, which I think 7 of the 11 of you sort of explicitly said, I'm interested in health outcomes. And so if you're interested in health outcomes, okay, how do we get to those health outcomes? Well, you usually want to have some sort of statistical modeling. And so there are definitely ways that you can link social network data to statistical analysis, and I've done a lot of that, and it seems to be a very effective way to bring the insights of social network analysis to the audiences that we tend to try to communicate to. And so I'm going to focus most of the analytic techniques on those kinds of approaches, and we will get deeper into whichever of them seems to be most exciting or useful to you as we move on. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, cool. Okay, so
what about the second question, the ego and
the ego? So sociometric or whole network analysis. So egocentric is you're in the middle of your social universe, and really all we know about is your direct ties to individuals, and we know a lot about and I'll talk about the distinction in more detail in a second. And then the other is the whole network. So that's when you can somehow define a boundary around a social space. So maybe in your case it could be this housing project, or in your case as well, you've got this congregate living situation, and so you can be looking at not just those individuals and what is their complex set of network ties both within and without of that congregate living space, but you could also model how is everyone connected within that congregate living space, and do the connections within that congregate living space potentially have some importance to outcomes. For example, like, are people who are more integrated to more people who are also integrated to more people, are people in dense sub-pockets within those congregate living situations the people who are most likely to stay, or not? That could be a very straightforward first question to ask of a whole network analysis, because then you're interested not only in, does a given resident have 3 or 4 connections to other residents, but do those 3 or 4 connections to other residents, do they dead end there? Or do those 3 or 4 other connections lead to another 3 or 4 connections that lead to another 3 or 4 connections, so that in the end, that one person, although they may only have 3 or 4 connections themselves, within a short number of blocks down these network ties, you actually might have 50 people that person is embedded within. And that might be a very more positive outcome for someone in a congregate living situation than someone who is part of a very small, otherwise isolated networks, where, say, you only have 3 people connected to one another who have no relationships to anyone else within that building. So you've got this very tight little triad of people. But what happens if one of those people dies? And then that triad's broken, and it's just this dyad, and it doesn't have the same dynamics that it had before when it was a triad. And suddenly those other 2 people with their loss become kind of socially disconnected from one another. They don't have any other ties to the rest of that community, and suddenly they fall out and go back to being homeless. I mean, that's the kind of difference that sort of a sociometric vision of the world or an egocentric vision of the world can give you, because in both of those cases, you start off with a person who maybe only has 2-3 ties to other people, but in one case they're part of a much denser little universe that can support them. In the other one, they're in a much more fragile universe that's kind of like a little island of a couple of people. And in the paper that I sent out, where I did this sociometric analysis, I was trying to problematize the idea of, well, if we know that from the literature on almost any health behavior problem that people tend to do like their friends. So you're a smoker, you know your friends are smokers. You're obese, your friends are obese. You're an heavily involved in HIV risk behaviors, probably your friends are too. But what does that look like when we start to expand that to a larger universe? Do we have these little isolated pockets of 3 or 4 people who are doing things that are relatively disconnected from everybody else? Do we have a large, integrated core of people, where any one person's connections to 2 or 3 people is actually part of a much larger structure that has the ability to spread, sort of negative influences or positive influences, and those are 2 very different looking universes. And so that's what this sociometric data can really start to tell us about.
So would you say that for egocentric, the unit of analysis is an individual, and the unit of analysis for the sociometric is more the actual network?
I want to say in a simplistic answer, yes, but that's not really true. As we get deeper into it, I'll show you that within, let me skip ahead one slide. So within, this is an egocentric network, okay? So within an egocentric network, you want to think about the gray dot. This is going to be the person who we interviewed, okay? And we're going to ask them about the people around them. And in this case, because I'm usually interested in risk and resilient behaviors, I'm going to define this. This is sort of a conceptual diagram. Here's some friends of mine that are engaging in risk behaviors that are in red, and not the people who are engaging in healthier behaviors in blue, right? And so we're trying to understand what's going on here. So one way that we typically look at egocentric analysis is as the individual as the unit of analysis. So we might be looking at what proportion of this person's network is filled with risk. 50% of this person's network is filled with risk. We might also be thinking about how many people does this person interact with who are engaging in risk. So there's 3 people that this person is engaging in a risk. We might also think about, does this person have anybody in their network who is a positive influence? Yes or no. But we could also think about this era as the unit of analysis. So we could think about, from whom do I receive social support? Okay. So I've delineated these 6 different people, and I also can delineate a number of relational characteristics about those people. Hello. Which could be I'm loud, and that may discourage interlopers. Much quieter without that machine. Okay, it's probably better for the video camera. So this could also be the unit of analysis. So what you could be thinking about is the question would not be, is that gray dot more or less likely to, say, access HIV testing services, which is the sort of question that I often ask. And then so I would be looking at, if you have more friends who also access HIV testing services, are you more likely to access HIV testing services? Another question could be, from whom do you receive emotional support? Okay, and we would use some sort of standardized question around that. So, who do you go to if you have a problem that you need somebody that you can confide in, or something like this? And we could try to understand what are the characteristics of those relationships. So, is it people who I've known for a longer period of time? Is it people who have demographically similar characteristics to me? Is it someone who's a family member relative to someone who's a friend? Is it someone who's a romantic partner? Is it someone, from whom I also receive some sort of instrumental support, like financial resources, things like this. And so then we could actually be modeling the relationship as the unit of analysis. And then if we think about sociometric data, so here's a picture of a data set of 136 homeless youth accessing a drop-in center in 2008. And what you have here is, again, arrows are the relationships between people, the dots are the people themselves. So you see in this particular social network, what I had was a bunch of people who had no connections to other people in that drop-in center. And so those are the people that are grouped along the edge here without any arrows. And then you have some of these smaller little dyads and triads that I was talking about before. And then you have this larger, what social network analysis referred to as a small world network, which is kind of a counterintuitive thing to think about, because this big network we're going to call a small world. But the idea is it's from the Stanley Milgram paper again, where it's the small world problem. So like we run around when we have these coincidences where we find out that some new person that we met knows somebody who we know, and we say, oh my gosh, what a small world it is. And that's because we had been here, and then we realized that there was this person in between the two of us, and so we thought, oh, what a small world. So big networks in small worlds. So these, and in this case, some of the unit of analysis is the network itself, right? So we can find out how dense is this network. We can find out what proportion of people in this network are doing certain sorts of things. But the other thing that we can do is we can look at the individuals within this network as the unit of analysis, and we can think about how their position within that network is impacting their risk behaviors. So the main finding from this particular diagram, I guess you can see it okay here. So there's these blue dots, and those blue dots in this diagram represent methamphetamine users, and the gray dots are folks who are not methamphetamine users. And so what you can see here, even just intuitively looking at this network very quickly, is that the folks who are at the heart of this network, who are the most, in this case, centrally located and interconnected in this network, are more likely to be methamphetamine users. So there's something about the structure of this network that is encouraging methamphetamine use, and or this network has been formed around methamphetamine use. So we can't necessarily, from a snapshot, disentangle the selection or learning process that's inherent in this clustering, but we can, from sort of a bird's eye view of this network, understand this. But in this case, the unit of analysis is still the individual, but we're looking at them within the context of this larger social world. So it's kind of more like the network neighborhood sorts of analyses, So how you're still looking at a lot of, even if you don't go into GIS sorts of neighborhood analyses, but you look at where do you live, what sorts of services are around those people. You often have individuals who are your unit of analysis, and you're describing the sort of larger context around them. And so then the sociometric data provides us quantifiable ways of thinking about the universe or the social neighborhood around these people, and how that may or may not impact behaviors. And not all behaviors are networked. But I show as an example one that was very highly networked, because I think it's a nice illustrative example. So that's sort of in broad strokes, the distinction between these two things. One thing that I wanted to point out, and I meant to sort of point it out before we got into that distinction, but just as a brief little pitch for why I think this stuff is so important. I mean, obviously you're all in the room, so you have some interest in this inherently, but I think that it fits the perspective of social work and also public health really, really well. I mean, we've always, intellectually been interested in how, as a person, in the social environment. And we teach a class, human behavior in the social environment, right? I mean, so I always feel like I'm a good person to be teaching that class, because, and I love teaching that class, because the social environment piece of it is what I do, human behavior in the social environment. That's what my research is all about. And I feel like social network analysis provides a really nice set of tools for quantifying and describing in very explicit ways some concepts that I think previous to these techniques get a little bit of hand waving. So I think social support papers are great, and I've worked on them myself, but sometimes they end up being a little bit vague. we know, oh, this person has a sense of having a lot of support in their universe, but we don't really know from whom, or and what sorts of supports do those people have, and we don't really know a lot about what that means. We just sort of have a vague, even with these very explicit psychometrically validated instruments, it still feels a little bit like hand-waving to me, and this gets a little bit deeper. And then the other piece of this is that I think social workers get trained a lot in this. I mean, you do these genograms, you sit down with clients and help them understand, these mappings, like how do you, what's your world and how do you understand support? And this is something that's been done for decades within social work. And I also think that there's some network theory stuff, so like Mark Granovetter, for example, that can be useful that I don't think that social work has really contended with, because I think that social work, I think sociology did a really good job of alienating social work in mid-20th century. I'm a sociologist by training, so that's why I feel like I can get away with saying these things. And I feel like sociologists largely disown me, so that's fine. I'm way too applied for. I'm way too applied for. I'm way too applied as for sociology's taste, which is fine by me. I feel like what I do is important, and that's it. If they don't, that's fine. But I think that there's some network theories that haven't been used, and largely because psychology, I think, was less alienating to social work, and so social work really latched onto a lot of psychology theories and less so sociology theories. I think that sociology theories were viewed as a little bit abstract and not so useful, because it's things like Weber and Durkheim about these big systems and how's that going to actually help us deal with this family with their child welfare needs. And but by the time these social network theories started to come out in the late 60s and early 70s, the disconnect between social work and sociology had already begun. And yet these theories, I think, are really useful. So I'm not going to do a lot of theory talk, but if you want more theory stuff, I'm happy to give you a long reading list of great papers to think about, because I think that those are all very useful.
Can I just introduce?
Yeah, sure.
On the,
you want to bash on sociology too?
Oh, no. But as you were mentioning that with research on social support and how like the ways why would social support matter, and sort of some of the hand waving that happens and sort of the implicit assumptions. And I think with the social capital literature, I think like it's a similar kind of thing where there's so much looking at social capital and neighborhoods and health and all these different outcomes and many iterations of that. But if you really think about what are the pathways that would make social capital at this more aggregate level matter?
Yeah.
I think like that's where it seems like social networks perspective could kind of help make some of those linkages.
I agree. I mean, I remember, as now that I'm a pretentious professor, but when I was a pretentious graduate student, being taught about, so I was trained in sociology at Stanford, and so one of the fun things about being a social network and an analyst usually is that you can trace your lineage back. And so almost everyone who has social network training can trace their lineage back in a couple of steps to this guy Harrison White at Harvard in the 60s. And he was a physicist who then got a second PhD in sociology and started teaching sociology. And he is really kind of the godfather of modern social network analysis. And his students became really the sort of the forward guard of this stuff. And so Mark Granovetter was probably his most famous student is The Strength of Weak Ties. I don't know if you guys have read it. It's been cited like 15,000 times or something obnoxious like that. I mean, it's an amazing paper. So he was my graduate advisor when I would, and then I started working with this woman, Lisa Bienenstock, who was a student of Phil Bonasich, who was also a student of Harrison White's. And Granovetter was a student of Harrison White's. So my students could say, I'm a student of Eric Rice, who's a student of Mark Granovetter, who's a student of Harrison White. I mean, there's this very networked sort of thing, and everyone can trace back their lineage more or less. And at the time that I was learning these things, I was really frustrated with social capital for exactly that reason, because I was learning all this stuff about very concrete ways of thinking about networks and what was happening in these networks, and really trying to explicitly operationalize exactly what was going on here. And then at the same time, you had this very popular theory that was coming out. This Bowling Alone book was huge, and social capital was this buzzword, and everyone was doing it, in part because it fit into survey research really easily compared to this stuff that doesn't fit into that quite as easily. And it's social capital theoretically is a social network theory, but operationally not as much. But I think that it can, just like social support, I think if you want to bridge the gap, you can. And so you just need to start thinking about taking those social capital ideas and placing them explicitly within the context of these network ties, and you can start to then model the social capital action in a much more explicit way. So one of my PhD students, Anamika Barmanadakari, she's now going to be a professor at the University of Denver. So she has this paper that is in press now that's going to come out very soon, and I can forward it to you guys if you want, where she is looking at why is it that some homeless youth use employment services and others don't. I mean, one of the important things you need to do if you're a homeless teen is you need to get a job so that you can get a place to live, so that you can get off the streets. Or at least that's the wisdom that we have. You know, maybe getting them a house first would be a useful thing, but this is the thought process. So in this paper, she's really looking at three different theories, three different social network theories, and trying to see which of those three different theories might be the one that's giving traction. So one of them that she looks at is a very what she refers to as a structural network theory, which is kind of what I was talking about here. So is your position in these larger networks driving the action? So are kids who are out here more likely or less likely to be using, services than the kids who are in here? That's one. The other is sort of a more sort of Bandura-driven, homophily social influence story. So are you going to be using services if your friends are using services? Or and then she also was looking at, I guess she did four. She was also looking at social capital sorts of ideas, or three social capital ideas. So is it that if you are connected to somebody who's providing you with some sort of instrumental capital, are you more likely to be using these services? Or what if you're getting some sort of emotional capital, are you more likely to be using these services? Which you could also think about as sort of a social support kind of idea as well. But she was really interested in explicitly mapping out not just these ideas as a general thing, but specific linkages and how those might play out. And in the end, what she found actually was that the social capital theory-driven hypotheses were the ones that were really giving, payout for her. It was, having more of these emotionally supportive ties in this network space was leading kids into using these employment services, but having more of these instrumental ties was actually discouraging of that. So there's something about kids who are relying on essentially street economy, instrumental support networks from one another that were really essentially outside of the more normative kinds of systems that we wanted to. And so it was this interesting way in which some kinds of connectivities and some kinds of capital were really good for them and other kinds of capital weren't. But she was able to get at these subtle distinctions because she was able to map out literally which kids who are providing which kinds of capital to others were the ones who were doing better. And so I think that that's a really useful thing to do.
Can I just ask a question? Did she do it by mapping the whole network, or did she do it by mapping the ego network?
She actually did both. So very few people do both. It's there tends to have been a relatively strong split between you're either doing an egocentric social network analysis or you're doing a sociometric social network analysis. You pick one or the other. Unfortunately, though, in some real-world contexts, that doesn't make so much sense. So what we have here with homeless youth is this is a sociometric depiction of street ties. But this young person, so what's interesting about this data is that on average we've got about 3 ties per person to other people within this data set. But when we collected this data, we originally collected egocentric network data of people. And on average people had about 13 ties. So what that means is that on average about 3 out of 13 were to other kids in the street network. Those other 10 ties were to other people who had nothing to do with this network. So it was friends from home, family members, agency staff workers, other just adults they knew in the community, these sorts of things. And so in this context, this is only part of the universe, but it's a really important part of their universe, but it's only part of it. So she was actually looking at both, which is not done so frequently, but you can. Particularly if what you're thinking about is at the end having your individual as the unit of analysis. So then you can be thinking about modeling aspects of what's happening to them based on where they are in this position, who they're connected to, what's being transferred across these ties. But then you can also be looking at thinking about, controlling for or as separate, independent effects of connections to other sorts of networks, which you would know about as kind of being uniquely positioned around each one of these individuals, but for whom we're in this network drawing, we're not depicting those people. Okay, so I think I've done enough talking about okay, so a little bit of language. When we're talking about egocentric network analysis, which is what I'm going to do first, because I think that's where most of you are probably going to be starting with. This is great data to start with because it's very easy to collect within the context of a survey. You don't have to be thinking about how are you bounding your population or any of these other things that we're going to get into when we talk about sociometric data. This is really just a function of you've decided to create some sort of sample and you want to know about people's individual constellations of the networks. So typically people use the language of ego and alter. People that hate Freud don't like the fact that we're bringing the word ego back in, but we don't mean the ego and the id, we mean the individual, and so we talk about egos and alters. And to get this data, what you need is a name generator and a name interpreter. And so the name generator is really the first and important thing. So how are you going to get people to nominate the ties that you're interested in, right? You have to have some sort of way of defining for people who you're interested in them talking about. So think about when we were talking about the Facebook example for a second, right? Within any one person's Facebook account, they probably have, 5 different, universes of ties that you could be asking for. So which universe of ties do you want to be studying? So you really need to think very carefully about this, and this should be driven by your research question. So a classic name generator, and this is from the General Social Survey that's been being conducted since about 1984 through the National Opinion Research Center, is from time to time most people discuss important matters with other people. Looking back over the last 6 months, who are the people with whom you discussed matters important to you? And then you're asked to list up to 5 people's names. And so this is being defined as essentially like the way that people talk about this particular name generator conceptually is a close conversation network. Maybe that's useful to us, maybe it's not. I guess you can do this in a couple of ways. One way is to have what's referred to as a free recall name generator. This is what that last example was. So it's sort of an open-ended question. Who are these people? And then you list them out. There's no cognitive prompts. There's no list of potential people that you could be checking off. It's just who remembers it. There are all kinds of studies talking about how lousy people are at remembering the important people in their lives. So the typical way that you want to contend with that problem is you want to do more than they did in the General Social Survey. You really want to have an initial question and then follow-up prompts that try to give people more cognitive triggers to try to remember more people. So for example, if I were to just cold say, tell me about who you've been talking to in the last week, you're probably going to start with a couple of people that you talked to this morning. And then it's going to take you a while to get back to last Friday morning. And you're going to be like, oh yeah, that's right, I talked to my Aunt Sally on Friday, on Sunday morning last weekend. But it's going to take me but you're probably not going to remember that right away. And people tend to have a lot of time bias toward this, and they also have a lot of affect bias. So people are very quick to remember, their best friends, their wives, their husbands, their children, their parents. their bosses, their closest coworkers, but they forget other people really quickly. And so what you tend to want to do is have multiple ways of prompting them. And I'll give you an example of that here. So, in my study, what I wanted to do with homeless youth was I really wanted a wide universe of people that they were interacting with over the last month. The issue with homeless youth is that they're very isolated. They tend to, when I was developing this name generator, I stumbled around a lot at first. I did a bunch of qualitative research, open-ended interviews with people to figure out how to elicit a good social network from these folks. And I would strongly encourage you, if you're going to do a social network survey, to do this preliminary work with at least a half dozen or so people in your target population who you can figure out what kind of name generator you need. Because when I first did this, I said to a couple of young people, I said, okay, tell me who your friends are. I don't have any friends. Okay. That's not going to work. Tell me who the important. I want you to list out the important people in your life. No one's important. Or I have one person. I'll give you one person who's important. And you'll say, well, who else? Like, no one else. And it's not that they're not interacting with anyone else. It's that they really are very, very isolated, and their sense of who is a friend, that means something very deep and meaningful to a homeless youth. It's not like, in fact, one of the most important follow-up questions that I found to ask in my surveys of homeless youth is, which of these people that you've nominated as part of your social network are actually your friends? And those people tend to be the most influential in terms of their behaviors. It's a really important clue to what's going on in their lives. So, through this fumbling around, I realized that with the current sort of sense of people talking about networks all the time, that one of the things that's actually very useful is to say, I want to talk about your social network. That people have a sense that their social network includes people who are important to them and people who are less important to them. And so I would tell people, now I'm going to draw out a map of your network. So this is from the 2008 study that I showed you that diagram from. So this is literally how I collected that data. This was the first question that I asked. And then and typically they would start to list out 3 or 4 young people. And what I would do, and I'll show you a little bit just to give you a preview, I realized that collecting social network data from people is a very boring exercise, because one of the things that you can do, and you can do badly, is you can have them list out all of these names that you write down on a piece of paper that you're holding like this, and then you ask them a bunch of questions afterwards, like, okay, so you've listed out these 25 people. Does Eric provide you with a sense of well-being? Does Andrea provide you with a sense of well-being? Does Jagdisha provide you with a sense of well-being? And on and on and on. So you've asked them one question 25 times, which is horrible if you are, say, a meth-using 20-year-old who hasn't slept for 3 days. So what I found to do with this relatively squirrely population is that if I drew out a map in real time with them of their network, it became this visual thing that was in front of us that we could talk about and I could hold out in front of them. And also then, as I subsequently started to ask them these follow-up questions, I could start drawing all these crazy cribs or answers to questions. So that I would say, okay, who provides you with a sense of well-being? And then they would just point, he's buying this one, this one, this one. And I would just write and I'd just crib them like this. And so one question became one question, not 25 questions. And so, and there's some research that suggests that, doing it that way is cognitively less burdensome to people. I mean, it's not like I'm the first person who've ever thought to do this. I'm just the first person to have kind of done this with homeless youth and kind of done it in a pseudo-genogram-y kind of way. So what I would do is, as they would start to peter out after 2 or 3 people, then I'd say, okay, I'd have these prompts. All right, do you have any friends that you forgot to list out? How about any family member? How about people you're hanging out with, you're chilling with, you're kicking it with? So part of this slang language is because as I was talking to them, and I would say, how do you describe these people? They'd be, oh, these are people I kick it with. I'm like, okay. So I may be a 40-year-old geek, but I'm going to ask you who are the people you're kicking it with. And then who's your baby mama, or who's your baby daddy? I sound like an idiot when I say that, but that's how they're talking about their They're, not the girlfriend that I have right now, but the woman who has a child that I have with, that I can't stand, but I talk to, on a regular basis because we have a child in common. So this is stuff that you have to do. And then I also found out really interesting things when I was doing these preliminary work that basically, even in 2007 when I was starting to do this stuff, that they were all online and they were all using MySpace at that point, and and a bunch of them had cell phones, and I was completely blown away by this. And this has become sort of like, I think probably the line of research that I'm most well known for is this work on social networking technologies and cell phones and how this is impacting the lives of homeless youth. Like there's like an AJPH meta-analysis, systematic review that came out, I don't know, in this special issue on homelessness, and like 7 of my papers are in this systematic review, which is kind of weird to me to see that work show up in that kind of way. But that was all spurred from these same interviews where I was fumbling around trying to figure out how to talk about these people, that they were telling me about these prompts that I never would have thought of initially at that time, which was, well, how about people that you're talking to online? How about people that you're talking, because I was thinking like every other, idiot over the age of 30, when I was talking to these homeless youth in 2007, that their lives must be like the way that they're being described by all this literature that came out in the 90s as street life, and then that's what their universes are. But, homeless adolescents, I think, is a bad way of talking about it. We should say adolescents who are homeless. I mean, it's a more awkward sentence, but I mean, they're teenagers first, and so they're on this anyway.
I just had a few reactions to what you're saying. So let's say, you're mapping out their social network, and there's 12 people in it, and the relationship with them, and distance and all that. What if you have to include, online social networks, and there's 50 people that they talk to electronically? How does that...
Well, what I've found is that people tend to, it depends on your, that's okay. Sorry. It depends on the population that you're talking about. And so here's one map, and here's another one. So this is a person who had a lot more ties, and the red lines in this data collection endeavor were folks who you're talking to online. And so one of the things that this person had was, as I delineated this set of as they delineated their network to me, they didn't list all 600 of their Facebook friends. That wasn't how they intuitively just through this series of prompts did this. Now, I suppose that I could have done a different data collection effort, which would have been to say, tell me the entire roster of your Facebook account, and then start to delineate who those people are to me. But that would be a very different animal, I think, than what I'm looking for, which is much more of a, within the last month, who is the communication network that you have. So in a sense, what I've tried to do with this name generator here is to create a version of that 1984 conversation network generator that makes sense to homeless youth, right? And in the course of doing this, I've really come to believe that I get both strong ties and weak ties in this. So I get people that are really important to them, and I get people that are a little bit more casual to them. But I don't get really ever from homeless youth with this prompt and then these subsequent questions a listing of 200 people on their Facebook accounts. I do sometimes get this really interesting thing where a kid in the midst of this will pull out their phone and pull out their contact list and start saying, yeah, that, oh, I forgot about them, yeah. And them. And so they'll use this as kind of like their own roster of their lives to help give me context. And I actually think those are probably the most accurate networks that I get, or when people use their phones or pull up their Facebook pages or whatever to start giving me a list, because it reminds them about the Aunt Sally conversation better than my saying, how about your family? Because then they're still thinking about, no, I don't have any family, I don't talk to them, and but when they see that name, they think, oh yeah, that's right, that happened. Okay, so I used to draw out the networks like this. Now I have an app that I use to do this. I had this app program. Yes?
I think before you move to this.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Part of my question, which is connected to what John asked. I was thinking about this in terms of, I guess my question is there any research that you're aware of that actually would use this method and compare it to things that you could generate from social media apps, like WhatsApp, where people are texting a lot, and thinking about what those networks are like, and you can actually have digital trails?
I think that there is some of that going on. I haven't seen any of it with high-risk populations. I know a woman who's an assistant professor in the research line at Sonia Negro at USC, who has a K Award, and what she's doing is she's looking at youth who have been were identified, so they're teenagers now, but they have been identified at some point as having contact with the child welfare system, like having some sort of child welfare report brought to bear. And she's created, or had created for her, this app. It's a Facebook app that downloads everything. Every friend, every post, every message, scrapes everything off of these youths' profiles, and is able to look at those things. And so she's looking very intensely at that data, but I don't know how much she's comparing that data to these data. I mean, I also know some people who've started to do a little bit of work with cell phones, trying to do some of this, but I do think that there's a disconnect. People are bad at remembering who they actually talk to. They're not necessarily that accurate at telling you who they talk to. I mean, social network data actually does a better job of explaining variance in behaviors than a lot of other stuff does. I mean, you'll see even some of the lousy model, if you can get an R-squared in a regression model that gets you over like 0.1, you're usually pretty happy. Network models are always better than that. Like people just do like their friends a lot of times. So even with all that recall bias inherent, people are pretty good at telling you about things, but people forget a lot because our communication patterns are so dense and they're so complicated and they're so unself-conscious that I don't think that we do a very good job of eliciting them, or we don't do a very good job of talking about them.
I'm just wondering, thinking about your older people as to whether anyone's looked at the differences between older people and younger people in recall and in this use of digital media and stuff like that.
I mean, there certainly are social network studies that have been done with older populations, and there are certainly ones that have been done with I don't know of off the top of my head, but there may be one that's looked at some of these cognitive recall issues. I mean, most of these cognitive recall issues studies tend to be, unfortunately, done with college students in like Psych 101 pools and things like this. So it's let's grab an easy to get to population, let's try a bunch of different network elicitation techniques, and let's see what happens. Or they'll do online surveys, and so again, you're kind of grabbing, lousy convenience samples, and you're saying, well, if we try this or if we try that, if we do this or if we do that, what tends to, how do people get through these things faster? How do they, which one tends to give us bigger, more expansive networks, these sorts of things. But, I think moving forward, we will probably have more ability to use technology as a way of validating social network data, and maybe even as a way of collecting and delineating social network data. I mean, I think, to me, one of the things that could be that I would like to do moving forward would be to do much more with youth who have cell phones and trying to, the ethical issues are really tough. I've got a friend who's at the University of Chicago who is really interested in pursuing a line of research with homeless youth and their cell phone use that's really about data dumping, right? So he just wants to get homeless youth who use cell phones, and he wants to study their social networks through their cell phones, and he just wants to get them to give him permission to do data dumps so that he can really look at what's going on, at least with respect to this digital connection. And he's having a lot of, he got clobbered in his last grant review because actually it was very disparate. One person thought it was like the most brilliant, innovative thing they'd ever heard of, and then the other reviewer thought that it was you know, a dead-in-the-water study because it was ethically impossible to do. You know, and so
Very
somewhere, you know, it was just typical for dealing with risky populations, right? So, you know, so somewhere in between, you know, so I think that there's potential for it moving on, for sure. Oh God, okay. At this rate, it's going to take me all day to just get to the slides, but that's fine. This is what you guys want to know.
So I'm assuming that part of what we want to do with these types of things, when we're asking multiple people these questions, is to see if they're nominating the same people. Is that part of the idea here?
Well, if you are, with this kind of elicitation technique, what I was trying to get at was two different things simultaneously. Knowing what you can do with egocentric data and what you can do with sociometric data was actually double dipping. So I was collecting both at the same time, and you guys can collect both at the same time, I think, and I would encourage you to think about doing it. Because with egocentric network data, what you're interested in is how do different types of ties that have different sorts of different qualities of people, different qualities of interactions, impact me individually, me as an individual. With the sociometric data, what you're interested in is, are there pockets where action is happening? Are there people who are really, really important? So one of my driving questions that motivated this whole line of research was HIV prevention programming, and it's too bad that Jagadish just walked out of the room, because this is actually what he was interested in, so I should maybe hold the comment, but...
Well, so, I mean, basically, so you're kind of answering my question a little bit, so that there's one type of analysis where it is important. And so the basis of my question is I'm just trying to think how it's very challenging if you're doing it by name and call, because, you know, some person is like, oh yeah, AJ, and the other person is saying, yeah, Anthony. And how do you know?
World.
How do you know that AJ is the same person as Anthony?
Well, I'm actually in the middle of writing a paper about that.
Yeah.
We have developed a very complicated and rigorous way of doing that. And it's not easy, and it's incredibly labor intensive, but it's really worthwhile. So what you do, first of all, you have to slog through a really nasty IRB process to do this, but it's worth it. You need to collect very explicit identifying information about those people. So you don't just say, who's Anthony or who's AJ. You say, what other names is this person known by? What does this person look like? How old do you think that person is? What's their race? And here's my favorite one. What tattoos do they have? What tattoos do they have? Tattoos. We live in a universe in which increasingly people have tattoos. And particularly street kids almost all have tattoos. And almost all of them have visible tattoos. And not having tattoos is almost as distinguishing as having specific tattoos. So there are, for example, pockets, for whatever reason, is a common street name.
I can't imagine why that would be.
If you work with homeless youth, you know exactly why pockets is a common name.
I know why it is.
So pockets is a common street name. And there are, in the Venice Beach area, about 3 20-year-old-ish white kids named Pockets. Which one are you talking about? Well, are we talking about Pockets with the ICP Hatchet Man tattoo? Or are we talking about Pockets with the diamond, tattoo on his neck? Or are we talking about the Pockets with pink hair? Well, if you ask all of that explicit information, you know which one it is. The other thing that can happen, though, is that you can have a situation where you have a number of youth who have almost indistinguishable characteristics from one another, and still the tattoos doesn't even get you out of it. So we had a bunch of guys named Damien, who were about 20 years old, who were African-American guys in Hollywood. There were 3 of them. We were like, oh my God, who's who? And none of them had visible tattoos. Like none of them had the guy with the Crips tattoo on his neck. No, nothing like that. It was like every one of them was like
kid out of the foster care system, pretty clean cut, trying to get out of the life. They're almost indistinguishable in the ways that they were described. So what we had to do is we had to use co-nominations. So if I'm talking about Damien and I'm also talking about Mike, and then Mike's talking about Damien and he's also talking about me, we're talking about the same Damien. But if I'm talking about Damien and I'm talking about Sally, but not Mike, and Sally's in this other network, then you can kind of triangulate, which people are by the assumption of that people have shared ties. Now, even with that, you have some level of uncertainty, and so then what you end up with is you have a mapping of these are the universe that you're. For sure, we know these are the people that we're trying to. Oh, and the other thing that you can do is while you're collecting all this data, you watch. You look at who's talking to who, right? So you see like, oh, Damien's hanging out with those guys. Okay, you go back home and as you start trying to do the activity of linking all these maps together, you start taking extensive notes of who you saw Damien actually talking to while he was out there. Because if he's, if you're trying to figure out that Sally's, connected to that Damien or the other Damien, and you see this, every day at the drop-in agency, Sally's talking to this one Damien, that's the one that she's talking about, not this other guy that she never talks to. So that's the other thing that we did. So between the tattoos and the multiple names and the descriptions of people and the co-nominations and then just simply watching who people were talking to, we felt like we were able to get a very definitive set of ties, like these ones we know are for sure. And then there ends up being this universe of ties that you're like, I don't know, what is this? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And so right now, I'm working on a paper just kind of delineating this method, but then I'm also working with some computer scientists in the engineering department where we're working on doing some modeling of how much does it matter how accurate we are about knowing those ties. So there's this universe that we know for sure, and there's this universe that maybe yes, maybe no, and we're trying to figure out how important or not that maybe yes, maybe no is, and I'm not we're not there yet. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of how badly that messes things up. But there's some research that suggests that getting network ties wrong is really bad because it can create this, you don't just have missing data with respect to the number of individuals in your sample, but you have missing data with respect to ties, and that can end up being that you have, it almost becomes exponential in terms of the missing data. And so if you think about it in that very simplistic way, you can start to get very, very, sort of almost defeated by the thought of missing data within social network analysis. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, well, how much might it matter in terms of sort of the modeling of health behaviors and things like that we're doing? So, will you get different results if you have these very different network structures? And so that seems to be the more relevant question to me, not necessarily how much missingness, but how much does that missingness impact us? And that's really still like, it's kind of a question we don't know. So,
One more question.
Sure.
What's the size limitation on collecting these? Like, how many people manage to collect this data and still keep the data straight?
So what we've done is I don't know what the upper limit is. I don't think that we hit the upper limit. And we got up to, in one wave of data collection that I was doing, we had 380 youth who would nominate up to 50 people. Whoa. So, there was, in any wave of data, there would be several thousand nominations that we would comb through. But I had an R01 grant whose purpose was to collect this network data, and so I had a full-time staff who spent, they would go out for 6 weeks at a time to collect this data, and then they'd spend about 3 months afterwards combing through the data, figuring out who was who, and you would have to do that essentially right after, so you'd have to take extensive notes while you were in the field about who you saw talking to who, and then you'd have to then painstakingly right afterwards go through this process of trying to figure out, literally on a tie-by-tie basis. Okay, so this person was talking about talking about Damien. all right, do we think that, is this Damien one of the 3 Damiens who we interviewed, or is this Damien somebody who's completely other? You know, is this, and so, and there were, we ended up with a very complicated, and I'm just going like this because, you know, if you print it out at a reasonable font size, it's like 3 pages of paper down the road, this decision tree of, you know, how we were able to sort of cull out possibilities, and I likened it to like a Sudoku game, right? So it's like, sometimes you don't necessarily know where the number 3 has to go, but you know it can't go there. So sometimes what we would do is we would go through these ties and we'd say, okay, we're not sure yet if this person is connected or not. Maybe we're gonna make a little note there. That person for sure is not. You know, we know, so they're out of the network. They're not there. So done. This person's done. This person's done. This person's done. So you kind of, you'd almost like scrape away all the, I know that the 3 can't be here, 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 here. It's one of these 2 places, kind of thing. And so that's what you would end up doing. And then as you would get deeper down the Sudoku puzzle, you would start to figure out that the 3 goes there. And then we'd make the call as to, you know, that's where the network needed to be, where it needed to be created. So this is all talking about creating sociometric maps. And so creating sociometric maps is really hard. If you're starting with a free recall name generator. But this isn't even where I wanted to get to this morning yet, but it's okay.
So, what if this is just one piece of information you're collecting, and you're also collecting information on, for example, mental health, substance abuse, housing, and you can't do this? you can't, you know, 300 people, you just don't, it's not feasible.
So this
to
is
do
about 10
kind of
minutes.
thing.
So, and the way it takes about 10 minutes is that we've created this app that makes it go really fast. So what you do, and the app isn't quite ready to be shared, but I will, it's really close to being in a version that we can share. The reason that we can't share it is because of this screen. So I designed this to just do for this study. I didn't think, oh, if I start doing this, then every time I go and talk about this, people are going to be like, oh, can I use that? Didn't think about that at all. I maybe should have, but I didn't think about that. I just thought, who would want my stupid thing? So this first screen is where, as you're talking to the person and you read that name generator, you then start listing off all of these people's names. Now, one thing that you have to do, that you do have to go person by person, is you have to ask them for descriptive information if that's part of your protocol. Now, if you're just doing an egocentric network analysis, you may only just need the names. So you would not even need the rest of this mess. So here we're talking about how long have you known them, are you related to them? If so, what kind of relationship? And then we also asked about their race, we also asked about their age. So those are all like descriptors. So you get the full name and then you say, okay, I want you to now describe, I want you to describe Jaganisha. Like, okay, so tell me about how old do you think he is? What's his race? How long have you known him? Is he related to you? Does he have any nicknames? Does he have any visible tattoos? Et cetera, et cetera. And then once you get those things generated, so for a more standard survey context, you might only want to know how long have you known that person? How long have you known that person? Are they related to them? And what's their race? Maybe those are the only 3 that you want. So the rest of this screen is just junk to you. But unfortunately, the way this is programmed is it's locked into this. Like this wasn't built like SurveyMonkey or something. This where it was like, here, program your version of this survey for it. It's just like, it's built for us.
Can you just repeat those 3 things for egocentric? How long have you known them? What was that?
Oh, how long have you known them? What is their? Are you related to them? And if so, in what way? And then what's their race? And what's their gender? So those things tend to be a little bit easier just asked on a person by person level. But anything else you want to know is probably better done like this. So then what the app does is it pops up the social circle that's your social circle, and this app allows you to go up to 50 people. So that's the max size network you can do. And then each person's name shows up in this little rounded box, and then the questions, the survey questions that you want to know about these people run along the bottom. So who do you see or know or talk to at least once a week? And then you tap on the person, and it records the data. And there's also a button for all of them, so that if people say it's everybody, you can just click all, and they all light up green, or none of them, and then it will record that. And then not available can be if somebody refuses to answer the question, right? You should always give people the opportunity to not tell you about things. And then what you can also do with this, it's kind of cool, is like there's essentially like a toggling function. So if they say like everybody except for Jonathan, you can click all, and then you can untoggle Jonathan, which is kind of a nice thing. And so then each one of these questions just pops along the bottom. You keep doing this, and then what one of the really important questions that you want to get at is the interconnections amongst people. So we also then have this data collection procedure where it then asks you, who does Jacob know? And so then it'll ask you, who does Jacob know? You then tap on, the person will then delineate who it is that they think Jacob's also connected to. And then all of that data ends up getting dumped out as a comma-separated value file that you can read into an Excel file that you can then put into your statistical software, and you're good to go. Whereas in my previous iterations of doing this, and this is sort of how you do it without this app, if you want, is that you can you write people's names in the circles. I whited them out to just keep the anonymity of this person intact, because this is actually a real sheet. And then what we did in this early version was that we decided on about a dozen questions that we felt we could ask as follow-up questions. And we came up with symbols for each one of these questions that represented something. So, like, a star was somebody who made you feel good about yourself. An F was someone who was a family member. The female symbol was for someone who was female. The @ symbol referred to somebody who you can go to for help or advice. The X was somebody who uses drugs, or someone who's sexually active. An X with a circle around it was somebody who uses condoms. So we came up with all of these different symbols that sort of we tried to make them have some sort of sense to us, but mostly it was just having our staff memorize for the 15 questions that we asked what the 15 symbols were. And then we just had to practice drawing these maps where we kind of cribbed the symbols around the circles and practice drawings. We then found that in a subsequent iteration of this that we wanted to ask more than 15 questions, and so the cribs we just didn't have enough space for the cribs. So what we decided to do then was put the circles with the names around and show them and have that sitting in front of us with the participants so they could use that as their response prompt. And then we had a laptop where we had essentially an Excel, we actually used a Google Docs spreadsheet. And so in that we had, in the first column it had all of the questions. And then we would, across the columns we had the questions. And so we had and then we put in the rows the 10 or so items that the people that did. And then as we went, we would just click on those boxes, and put in an X for where it was that people were responding about. So which of these people uses meth? Eric, Sally, and click, click, click. And that worked pretty well too, because then we were able to maintain the visual stimulus that they could use to just sort of point to people. Because the tough thing is for people to keep it in mind. You've listed out 20 people. It took you probably 5 minutes to get them to list out those 20 people, and then now you're going to ask them 5 or 10 minutes worth of questions, and you're expecting them to remember those 20 people again, which is not going to happen. But if they're all sitting there in front of them, then they can do it pretty well. And then the only thing that we used the paper for, other than that, was at the end when we were asking people who's everybody else connected to. By far and away the easiest way to do that is to just literally draw the lines between people, as opposed to trying to keep straight some sort of matrix of ties while you're going. The downside of that is that you then have to have your field interviewers or your other RAs or you then painstakingly turn this dizzying mess of lines into data files afterwards, which is a really cumbersome process. But I think that the idea when you're doing applied work is that it doesn't matter how much time and effort it takes you to do it. It matters how much time and burden you're putting on these high-risk populations that are that you're interviewing. So So this is quick and easy for them, it's painful for us, but that's how we would do it.
When you're only collecting the egocentric data, do you always collect the relationships? Or is that your, move into the sociometric?
You mean like, is this a family member or is
No,
this
the
a...
family member, I understand, but in other words, drawing the lines between them, seems like that creates the sociometric diagram, right?
No. Well, what you've created is you've created an individual level diagram where, and there are, and I'll talk about this in detail in a minute, but there are specific structural measures of egocentric network data that you probably are interested in. So 2 things that you can think about intuitively very quickly about these 2 different networks that I showed you. One, this is smaller than the other. Okay? You don't need any lines to see that. You just need to know the number of people. But the other thing is that this diagram is relatively sparse. So notice that he has a number of connections to these people, but these people have very few connections to one another. This diagram, even though it's both much larger, but it's also much more interconnected. And so this person's universe is different along 2 dimensions, both the size of the network and also the density of the network. And those things can have an independent relationship to one another in terms of particular behaviors. So one of the thoughts is that larger networks can be better for people, but not necessarily. Denser networks tend to be more reinforcing of behaviors, which if you're in a risky context can be bad. If you're in a healthy context can be good. So there's some initial forays into kind of math modeling that you can even start to do with this stuff, and what you end up doing. Well, let me get into it.
When's your app going to be available?
Well, you can actually download it right now if you have the old version of the operating system before Apple upgraded to the new version of the operating system still on your iPad, which we've kept because we have the old version, and you want to just use the exact same questions that I've got. We're working with a programmer to redo it, so hopefully like next year maybe it'll be something that we can start to share with people. I mean, we definitely want to share it with people. It seems good. So okay, so here's the name generator. We've got this. So here's the attributes. So okay, so let me think. It's 11 o'clock. We've been going since about 9. I could either kind of plow through for another maybe like half an hour, 40 minutes, and kind of finish up with the egocentric stuff, and then after lunch we can talk about sociometric stuff and whatever else you want to talk about. Or we could take a break for like 5-10 minutes if people feel like they want to rest, stretch. Let's take a break for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to it. Oh.
Depends on how much coffee you had this morning.
Yeah, I think I might have to take some more there. Okay. Then I'll use the bathroom.
So before lunch, I will be actually talking about how to do some egocentric network right now. So we really just talked about collecting data at this point. Now I'm going to talk about how do you actually, what do you do with that data once you've got it? And that's probably as far as I'll get. And then after lunch, I'll talk about, I've kind of talked already about collecting some of the social media, so I'll skip that right and get more quickly into what you do with that data. Oh, that's okay. Hey, no, it's fine. I mean, they're videotaping it, so if you can get them to
Where are you? How far are you?
I just turned in a draft.
You can have access to that.
I didn't see it after my chapter. I just kind of gave it up. So I'm still waiting. Thank you.
Sure.
So you said, or something that you would use to follow up between each individual. More questions.
No, but I could get it. Okay. Yeah. Because it really depends on the context that you're working on and
Mine
what
was
you
easy,
want to
like
do.
I
So
saw
unlike,
mine,
say,
Like, oh, yeah.
oh, yeah, that's true.
They read it, you know,
Health
I was.
surveys or other sociometric, or not,
A really good friend of
other
mine is-
psychometrically validated surveys. These are the 15 items you always have to ask. With social
Yeah,
networking, it's much more keyed into what do you want to know.
No,
So,
actually, we're in,
if you, in my context, what I was interested in was HIV risk and substance use and behaviors, and
we make it.
that being really the most important stuff to me. And also then,
Yeah, she's
resilience, high resilience issues as well. So I was asking, the questions I was asking is, who on this list uses meth? Who on this list uses cocaine? Who on this list uses marijuana?
So you do.
Who on this list uses
Yeah, I think-
session? Who on this list do you think uses condoms and abstinence?
Yeah.
Who on this list have you ever talked to? Where to get tested for HIV? Who on this list do you get? Who on this list makes you, can you go to a well advice? Who on this list could you borrow $10 from?
For help or advice, for example. Right. So what if you just kind of want, who do you know,
Right, so some of the things that you could do is you could ask, so one of the questions that's really good for getting at distance is, so strength of ties is important, I think, in grant better. It is defined by three things. It's defined by the duration of the tie, the affect strength of the tie, and then also the reciprocity of the tie. So you need to think about how are you going to come up with operational questions for all of my purposes to get at social distance. So what you might want to do is say, one of the things that I would do is,
I know.
if you know the population,
Used to be the,
the easiest way to do it is like, how long have you known this
and he's just
person?
gonna.
And that's one of the things that you ask on an individual by individual basis.
But he's
So when you ask them what's their name, you can say, how long have you known this person? Because then they can say, a year, 10 years, all that, right? Then,
I know his name.
the other thing that you want to do in terms of affect is,
It's cold, yeah.
I know.
you probably want to
And
ask
it's like some secret trick to actually, overriding
Let me see.
She's one
Secret trick is right.
Well, one of my cohort mates, she's got a net. Yeah, we have
So if you had to,
I know.
tell the three people
But
that
at least it's not stage too there, and it's, it's always inspiring to hear
it's been
about
just trying to find the three most important.
Yeah.
Why three? I don't know. I just started doing that. You could another thing that you could do is also ask, which of these people do you see at least once a week?
I saw you put your sport coat on, I was thinking, I wish I put a sport
You're right. And then another social distancing is this reciprocity. So with that, it's so
Maybe it's just not
who do you
working
go
too good
to
here.
for help and advice, and then
Well, it's kind of
who
like
provides
the,
you with help.
you
You
know,
provide
on the
help.
sixth floor, that corner conference room.
That's
Yeah.
grammatically
It's either one extreme or,
Oh,
And
yeah.
You'll find that people are very,
And it feels
very
like,
explicit
but now
about
I've spent so
these are
many
people who
hours
come to me, these are
tucked
people
away in
that I
there.
go to.
But
And
there's only
having-
one,
and having
Melvin
a
Miller's
relationship
been able to master
is
the
a
technique
closer,
of
there's less social
messaging.
distancing.
She hasn't shared that information.
She keeps it too, tight, huh?
Yeah, it's tight-fisted.
Oh, my God.
Well, no, we always had her to do it, so.
Maybe in aggregate, but probably as independent. So what you'd be doing is you'd be saying, here are people that I talk to frequently, here are people that I feel strongly about, and here are people that I have some sort of reciprocity. And that's going to
Check it, Isha.
That's going to define social
Like,
distancing. And that's going to be what, 6 questions? And that's kind of like probably, most basic. And then I would say, along this whole
I keep thinking of applications in my work.
Yeah.
As a next further.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm thinking this, wait a minute, no, I want to stay into my own bounded little space right now.
Yeah, and I was attempting to remember at the very beginning, I read a couple of articles where they looked at the sexual and social networks and overlaps.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Yes, definitely.
So when I was talking about degrees of separation, the running joke is
And then that's going to be sort of like, that's
black men
something
in New York City have sex with other men, it's like a sixth of an
Like, I have very
order
few
of
buddies who
a percent of a degree of separation.
Wow.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry, what was the number?
that is just like a ridiculous, the separation is just so ridiculously minuscule. And it's actually something that's an actual. Yeah, I mean, the social and sexual networks overlap, which is really.
You know, really interesting ways.
What's cool is to be able to see it visually, right? Yeah. I was actually thinking, I wonder, like, just, like, I was thinking about, first of all, the young person. I wonder if they're curious about having this information. And I can definitely see it being used in kind of therapeutic ways too, like, you know, kind of using it, kind of like a genogram or sort of idea, kind of use it as a way to help people think about their life and everything like that. So I was actually thinking about that too. I know that's not how you're using it, but I can see the potential for this.
Yeah. But even I'm looking at it programmatically, I'm thinking, where we kind of intuitively know where there are, you can have two different people who are both they have both 5 connections, but this one's connected to 5 highly isolated people, and this one's connected to 5 highly integrated people. So we kind of intuitively know that, because we see this day in and day out. But it would be really fascinating to actually kind of see it mapped out, whether the data in fact supports what we just had is basically hunches.
Yeah, sure. And this isn't any way I would want to use it, but I was thinking too, this probably has a lot of applicability for law enforcement. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Aspect of law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of figuring out who's doing the crimes and how they connected to each other.
It didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah.
Because you said that, the first thing I thought about was folks who can work with things.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because it would be really helpful to map out these networks.
Yes.
Yeah, especially like I think about especially where I grew up in Los Angeles.
Yes.
It's like thinking about like geographically, we could actually map these networks, how people are connected, where they actually are. Yeah, I mean, it would really strengthen their ability to influence.
Yeah. I could see how this could be like a big IRB thing.
Yeah. More, in your work, well, first of all, I don't know how bounded you can make that linear. Because that mentions that in the article.
All right. What can you do with this data? One thing that you can do with this data is you can start to visualize this data. I'm going to really spend the visualization time on the sociometric data, so I'm going to skip through these slides relatively quickly. After lunch, I'll actually pull up the program and kind of do what you can do with these things. But one of the things that you can do is you can create data files. So you can convert this thing into a data format, which essentially I'll show you more after lunch, so don't worry about too much of the technicality. But you can create a data file that allows you to delineate what the ties are in this network, and then you can look at it. So in a small network like this, it's not really that useful or that helpful to us because we already had a little map that was hand-drawn, so it's not like this gave us a lot more information about this. So in the context of egocentric network data, people don't typically draw the network maps that frequently, because it's usually not that much more informative than what you already had, particularly if you do it the way that I've been doing it, and it's just where you can just look at these big sheets of paper. So if you want to get a bird's eye view of what's going on, you're just sort of shuffling through these papers. If, however, you were collecting this as like online survey data, and you were only collecting network data from say like 5 on 5 ties at a time, this is something that I was talking with Jonathan about during the break. Is he was saying to me, well, what if I really just want to know about strong, really important relationships, and I've got really limited time? do I need to collect this much information? It seems like this is going to get really time consuming. And one of the things that people have done, and this goes back to the general social survey example I showed you from the 1984 thing, is limit it to 5 people that are the most important people. So I did a study recently where I was interested in guys using these smartphone applications as hookup apps. I do a lot of HIV prevention types work. And so actually it was Grindr.
Jacked.
Yeah. So it was 2 years ago, so it was Grindr. I know, it's like talking about MySpace. Oh, that was that. Now it's just like Twinks and Jocks in West Hollywood. They're the only people who still use that one, right? So anyway, this app, we wanted to know who was using it, and we wanted to do this online survey with folks. We knew we were only going to have about 20 minutes of their attention, but we wanted to get a sense of their networks and how these networks were impacting their use of these technologies, and whether or not their people in their networks even knew that they were using these technologies, etc. So we said, tell us about the 5 people who are most important to you. You have to list 5, and you can only list 5. And then we plugged that into the context of this online survey, and then because we were doing it as an online survey, we actually piped the names into the response categories. So when we said, who is it that you see at least once a week, the 5 names popped up, and then you just clicked on those 5 names. So the visual stimulus was simply this recurring list of 5 names. Because it was such a small network, you didn't need to have this big map. And so if you have some limitations to your capacity, or your question is really about strong ties, you might not need to bother with trying to get these really big networks. And then also after the fact, even though you want to collect information about the density of ties, and so you do want to ask eventually, of these 5 people, who knows one another within that context, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time drawing it out, because when you get a list of 10 ties, you've got a pretty dense network. When you get a list of 3 ties, you've got a pretty sparse network. And you can visually, just from the frequencies, you can get a lot of the information. So this network visualization is a little bit overkill for egocentric data. So what do we want to do with this egocentric data? Well, what we really want to do with this egocentric network data is we want to start doing analyses, right? We want to start doing statistical analysis. So the very first thing that you want to do is you want to know about the size of the network. This is usually the easiest thing to do. If you have artificially limited the size of the network to 5 people or 10 people, this is a completely redundant and pointless question. However, you may have created some questions that allow you to look at important subnetworks. So you might have something like, how many family members are in this network, or how many friends are in this network, or how many people provide you with support. So again, you might have some listing of size that is important of a subnetwork, even though the overall network isn't important. In the context of the data that I was collecting, where we had an open-ended number of people that you could nominate, that was one of the primary questions that we were interested in, was if you're a homeless youth and you're pretty socially isolated as a group, is having a bigger network or a smaller network better for you, worse for you? Does it depend on what's going on in that network? I mean, it tends to be usually complicated. Usually size alone isn't enough, but it's a variable you want to take into account. The next variable that you want to take into account is the density of the network. So is this a highly interconnected network, or is this not a highly interconnected network? So here's the first math formula, and it's probably the only one that I'm going to really regale you with today. What this means is it's the number of lines times 2 that you actually have divided by the number of nodes in your network times the number of nodes minus 1. So what you end up finding is that the total number of possible ties in a network is the number of nodes times the number of nodes minus 1 divided by 2. So if you think about a 4-person network, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible connections. So that's 4 times 3 divided by 2, which is 6. Okay? Which is an easy thing to do. You can just count it out if it's 4 people or if it's 5 people. But when it's 25 people, it gets a little bit harder to draw out all of those possible connections. And so that's the formula that you can use to do that. And what's nice is that it is a consistent formula. So if you've got size 25, it is going to be 25 times 24 divided by 2 as the possible number. So then if you want to know what the density is, you take the actual number of ties that were reported by your participant, and you divide it by the possible number of ties, which is based on the number of nodes in that network. And so you can create this sort of formula in SAS or Stata, relatively easily. And if you're really interested in getting code for doing that, I can provide you with code for doing that. But conceptually, this is what you want to do. And what you need to do is you need to do this on a person-by-person basis, right? So each person lives in a specific social universe of their own that has a specific density of their own. And so it's an independent observation for each and every single person. And so you need to program something into SAS or SPSS or Stata that will allow you to do this simple formula. So you take from the data that we've collected, the number of ties, and you divide it by the possible number of ties, which you just do as a formula. Okay, so what do we usually do with this social network, this egocentric stuff? So this is the good stuff. What do you usually do with this? Okay, so this is almost always theory driven. So one of the questions that Jonathan asked me is like, well, if you're going to do like a 10 or 15 item survey of social networks, what questions do you ask? And my response is always, well, what do you want to know about? So you really have to know your population, and you have to know what your research question is, because you really want to be asking them about whatever is relevant to what's going on. So maybe it's about social capital, maybe it's about sort of strength of ties of some kind. Maybe it's about, in my case, a lot of times it's about risk behavior. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is sort of the exposure to other risk-taking peers and the exposure to resilient peers. And so what I usually am asking a lot of questions of is, what behaviors are people engaging in, and what's your context of knowing that person? Because what I found in my early interviews, when I was having these interviews with people, I'd say to them, okay, so tell me about somebody who's a good influence on you in these informal interviews. And they would say to me, oh, this person here, I talk to them every day, and they really keep me sane, and they're really, they're in college, and I really look up to them. And I'd say, oh, great, where are they? And they'd say, oh, they're in Detroit. What do you mean they're in Detroit? And they're like, oh, I talk to them on MySpace every day. I'm like, oh my God, the world's different than I thought it was. So I realized that I was really looking at, behaviors, and then there's sort of this orthogonal dimensions. It was like, what are you doing, and then who is this, what are you doing, what's your relationship to this person, and where is this person located? So I was really interested in peers versus family, home versus streets, and then, are you risk-taking or are you not? So if you looked at that paper that I gave you guys to look at, and the reason I gave you those two papers is that the two examples that I'm going to go through didactically here come from those two papers, is how, I was interested in condom use, and what I realized was that condom use wasn't just how many people in your network use condoms. That variable actually turned out to be absolutely useless to me. Wasn't associated with anything. What it really was how many people in your network are friends from home that use condoms. So if I could tap into those kids who were talking about that friend in Detroit who is their anchor, that's where I was getting the action from. So it was somebody that you were communicating with through technology, and who was this positive influence and was outside of street life. Those were the resiliency anchors, at least with respect to condom use in that one paper. Okay, so how do you do this? Typically what you need to do is you need to have 3 different data sources that you need to strip, clean, cull, merge, and then analyze. This is actually the part that I think I spend the most time with my students who I've been teaching social network analysis. That density calculation is something really easy. I can just throw it on board like that, no problem. But this is actually the hard part. So if you do get into this data, into doing this kind of data, and you start to get a little bit lost into how to make these files all happen, please feel free to give me a call, ask me what's going on. I'm happy to try to coach you through the first couple times that you try this, because it's not always easy, but I never know quite how much to get into. Okay, so I take an Excel sheet, and I do these things here, and then I take it into SAS, and I do this kind of code here, and then take another thing that I put in here, and so I'll get into some of that if you want this afternoon. I mean, I'm happy to get into as much of the dirt as you want, but for right now, you want to think about what we've got is a standard survey data. So this is where you got the outcome data. So this is where you ask people, what are you are you having safe sex? Are you getting HIV tested? Are you using meth, etc. Then we've got these nodes and ties data. So one of the things that we pulled from this survey question was who is connected to who. So that stuff you tend to be, if you've got a big network, you need to go through this painful task of importing it into a program like UCINet. You have to create one of these little data files that I showed you here. Oops, here. You have to create one of these little data files for each and every single participant in your study. And then you need to read that into the program in order to get out of it the couple pieces of structural information that you want. You can sometimes take some shortcuts. So if, say, the only thing that you wanted to know about was size and density, you could actually just have your RA count the number of ties and write down that number, count the number of nodes, write down that number, and then you can just take that and put that into your data set, which is really what I would recommend if all you want is density. And frequently, size and density are the two sort of starting points. And so before you sort of slog through all of this mess, which you would need to do if you were going to do some weird things like subgroup densities and centralizations and other stuff that almost never turns out to have statistical significance with anything, I would say don't waste your time and kind of go about this. That data set, which I refer to as the nodes and ties data, you may actually be able to just have two or three numbers that you're then going to be merging to this data set. Then the real knit and grit is in this row per alter data set. So the way that I describe this row per alter data set is like this. So this is, how many of you guys are SAS users? Okay. How many of you guys are SPSS users? Okay, how many of you are Stata users? Okay, so Stata, pretty useful for social network analysis. SAS, super useful for social network analysis. SPSS, not so useful for social network analysis. The reason is that SPSS doesn't really have protocols for nested data structures that are too good. Now, every iteration of SPSS gets better, so it may be that SPSS can now do this, and I just don't know how to do it in SPSS, because the last time I was using SPSS, I didn't know how to do this. So if SPSS can do this stuff, awesome. I just don't know how to do it with SPSS. So what you have here is you can think about this as sort of being an analog to like school-based data, right? Where you've got a bunch of kids who are in classrooms, right? So we've got ego, and we've got person 3000, and we've got person 3001, person 3002. Now notice that we'll start with, I'm really focusing on person 3001 here. With person 3001, they nominated 18 different people. So I have 18 rows of data that correspond to person 3001. And in each row of data is person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way down to 18. And then I have some sort of attributes that correspond to that person. So in this case, that this person was someone who uses condoms. So this is alter is a condom user. That's what that means, alt condom user. And so what you see for person 3001 here is that they've got 2 people out of their 18 who use condoms. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to take this row per alter data set and we need to redact it down to, again, just one row of data for each one of our egos, because we want to be doing basic statistical analysis where in the end we want to be looking at a few different possibilities. Now, what I find is the thing that you possibly want to be looking. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. There's really 3 sorts. So the most relevant sorts of information that I find with these egocentric network analyses are describing the composition of these networks in some way. So who's in this network? And what I've found is that there's really 3 different basic ways of thinking about this. You can either do the absolute number of people who are of a certain kind. So how many people are using condoms in your network? 0, 1, 2, up to n. You could also do the simple presence or absence of a type of person. So do you have at least one person who provides you with social support, or at least one person who is a friend from home who uses condoms in your network? And then the other thing that you can do is you can do a proportion of ties. So what proportion of your network involves a certain behavior? So 2% of my network is, or 10% of my network is made up of condom users, or 50% of my network is made up of condom users. I find that the substantive question you're asking is really going to drive which of those three options is the most meaningful for you. So, for example, with social influence processes, we often think about it's either the proportion that matters. So it's not, so if I've got 4 people in my network and 3 of them are condom users, 75% of the people that I interact with are condom users. If I've got an 18-person network and 3 people use, I've got a network where 1/6 of my network is using condoms. That's not nearly as influential to me. So for influence, sometimes proportion is really where the pay dirt is. For social support, I oftentimes think that the count is where the pay dirt is, because it matters that you've got not just one person that does this, but 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. So as you have increasing numbers, sometimes not. Sometimes, particularly in influence or in support, it can actually just be presence or absence. Like, do you have at least one? And so there's a big difference between people that have, particularly when you're talking about isolated, vulnerable populations. Like if you've got one person who's an anchor in some way, that's all you need. And so that's really where the big distinctions are. And if you actually even graph out the proportions, you'll end up with these really super lumpy distributions where basically you have 50% of the population says nobody, and then you've got these really tiny tails that go out afterwards. And so things are so hyper skewed that you may as well just recode them as dummy variables. I also teach statistics to first-year PhD students, so if I fall into too much distribution talk, let me know. Okay, so then how do you go about creating these 3 different possibilities? You can kind of do them you can do them all at the same time. Now, one of the things that I've provided for you in the downloads is actually the SAS code that I use to turn this data into what I refer to as the row per ego data that has these summary scores in them. Now, one caveat that I'm going to give to Jonathan is that when you've only got 5 people in your network, everything gets way easier. Because when you only have 5 people in your network, for one thing, and you do a maximum of 5, or first of all, if you set the size of the network to a particular size, like it's always going to be 5 people, there is no difference between the absolute number and the proportion, because everyone's always got, the denominator is always going to be 10. So it's kind of redundant, or the denominator is always going to be 5 if it's a proportion, 10 if it's density. So it's irrelevant. The other thing is that a lot of the painstaking work of kind of creating these row per alter stuff can get a little bit easier with 5 people, just because you can get away with not doing things in this data structure. But I would caution against it for the simple reason that what you often want is not just how many people are friends of yours from home, and then how many people are condom users, and how many people are people that you talk to over the internet. But what you really want is you want the intersection of those 3 characteristics on one individual in your network. So think about it this way. You can have, maybe I should put it on the board. If you've got this, you've got these, say, you've got this 5-person network that you're talking about, right? And you've got, this person might be from, we'll say this person's from home, and this person's a condom user, and this person is on the internet. If you were to just do the presence or absence of having at least one person who's a condom user, at least one person who's the internet user, at least one person who's a home-based user, you'd say this person has one of those things. But what I'm really interested in knowing about is, do you have a person who's the intersection of all of those things? And if you just keep looking at, say, when you're doing a survey where you only have this 5 people that are possible responses, it's very easy to then take those 5 responses as a variable unto itself. So, what's the number of people who are from home? Great. All I have to do is say, like, the person said, A, not A, B, C, and D, and so I'm going to code answer choice A only as 1, or answer choice A and B as a 2, and it's a relatively, it's maybe not as easy of a recode as recoding your mixed race and other into one other category sort of variable, but it's still not that bad. But it won't allow you to create this intersection of data unless you structure it this way. And if you structure it this way, then you can start to create new dummy variables that really say, okay, who is a condom-using person who I talked to on the internet who's somebody who I knew from home? Give me a 1 for that person. And so that's what I did in the paper that I have, that I shared with you, is I took the intersection of those 3 characteristics to create this alt condom user variable. Is not who uses condoms in your network, but it's actually who is a condom user who you know from home, who you talk to online. That's how we get that variable. Once we get that variable, here's what we can do with that. The SAS code will allow you to create 2 variables. One of the things that's nice about SAS is it has this function that allows you to, if you see a repeating observation, if you've got a repeating ID number, you can actually tell it to do something to everyone who has that repeating ID. And you can also tell it to do it sequentially. So what you can do with this code is you basically tell it to start adding row 25 to row 24, and then row 26 to the sum of 25 and 24, row 27 to the sum of 26, 25, and 24, etc. So what we get here, this is a laser pointer. It's not great. Well, I'll just kind of, so look here, this is the alt condom user. So this is just, for this individual, were they that intersection of those 3 characteristics? And you notice that as I start to take the sum of those characteristics, it starts off as 0 because it's 0. So it's 0 plus 0, and I'm just adding 0, I'm 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 adding 0. I get to this observation where there's 1, so I add 1 to 0, so it goes to 1. Now I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0. Ah, here's another 1, now I've added 2. I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0, I'm still adding 0. And I finally bottom out at 2 of those total 18. For person number 3,000, by the time I got to person 23, they had found 10 people who had done this. Then, this proportion alt condom user, what I'm doing here is at each iteration, I'm dividing by the number of observations that we've seen. So what you see here is that at first, I've got 0 divided by 1, 0 divided by 2, then 0 divided by 3, 0 divided by 4, 5, 6, 7, then I get to 8. And now I've got 1 divided by 8, which is why I've got this 0.125. And now I've got 1 divided by 9, 1 divided by 10, 1 divided by 11, 1 divided by 12. Now I've got 2 divided by 13, 2 by 14, 2 by 15, 2 by 16, 2 by 17, 2 by 18. That's why I get to the 0.111. Now, what's nice here is that this stuff that's getting me to, that's kind of the counts along the way, it's really just getting me there. That information unto itself isn't particularly useful. This last line, however, is where the pay dirt is, because this is the number of people who are doing this thing, and this is the proportion of people who are doing this thing. And then it would be it's a very simple, straightforward matter to then, with SAS, what's one of the other nice things is that you can then say, okay, one of the things I want you to do for me around looking at these repeated observations is when you get to the last time you see that repeated observation, I want you to pull out that one line of data and store it as a new data file. And so at the end, what you can do is you can end up scraping this data, and you can just pull this last line of data. So across my 136 participants, even though I had like 2,000 lines of data, because each one of them had on average 15 people or something like that, I end up just with 136 lines of data again, because I'm just taking these summary measures. And now that piece of information is now ready to go. So now you just merge that like you'd merge any other data set with any other data set back to your parent data set, and you're ready to run your statistical models. So now what I've done is I've created this variable that says I've created a data set. I've now merged it back to the parent data set. So now what I have is I've scraped this one line of data. So the thing that you need to be conscientious of with this is that some of the data that you pull over is still really meaningful data, and some of it is just junk that you need to ignore because it's artifacts of the process. So for example, that it's alter number 23 or alter number 18, you could think of that as one of two ways. Either that's just junk that you don't need to know anymore, or it's size. So this is a really nice way that, if you were thinking about, oh wow, I was trying to figure out how am I going to get to this size, which is one of the things that you need to do in order to create that density count, here you go. You got size. Now with the alt condom user variable, now that's not so meaningful. Like, who cares that person number 23 was or wasn't a condom user? That probably doesn't tell us much of anything at this point anymore. So that we're going to ignore from here forward. But we've now got our very useful sum alt condom user, which is 10, and our proportion alt condom user, which is 0.43 or 0.11 or 0.2 or 0. And now we can also do a relatively simple additional recode, which would be to then create a presence or absence of variable. So we could just do a really simple bit of code to say, if proportion is greater than 0, then 1, if not, 0. And so now we've got a dummy variable that says, yes or no, I've got a condom using alter from home that I talked on the internet in my network. So that's what I did in this paper. And here's what that ended up doing. So this is from that 2010 paper, and so I was interested in a few different outcomes. So that you had unprotected sex at your last intercourse, you had unprotected sex, and you had multiple partners in the past 90 days, and then also that you were a condom user and you had one partner in the past 90 days. So I was really kind of interested in both risky behaviors in a very simplistic, like last sex, condoms or not. Then I was interested in, are you a high-risk youth, so you're not having protected sex and you're having multiple partners. And then I was also interested in, are you a low-risk youth, like you're not having very many partners and you're using condoms. And then what I was doing was I was simply entering in these different network variables. So in this case, this home-based electronic tie variable, that's the one that I just talked to you about how to create. The home-based interpersonal tie and street-based interpersonal tie. In this case, what those were doing was when I created the initial variable that started the whole process of the sums and the proportions, I was then trying to create the intersection of, this is somebody who is a condom-using person who you know on the streets, not a condom-using person who you know, who you're talking to across the internet. This is someone who you know on the streets, and you're talking to them face to face, and whether or not they're a condom user. That's what that variable is. This variable is, this is somebody who you knew from home, but you also are still talking to them face to face. So this is probably somewhat indicates a local youth or youth who are traveling together. And then the last one is the sort of the aha moment that I had with this young man who was telling me about his best friend from Detroit, who was the anchor for him. And then those are essentially being compared to the null of this. So these are people who don't have essentially any condom using ties, any condom using alters in their networks of any kind. And so what I saw here was that the street-based interpersonal ties were kind of important for reductions in unprotected sex, which was kind of nice because I was thinking I wanted to do an HIV prevention program with homeless youth that was peer-based. So it made me think that wasn't a hopeless cause. But then the home-based electronic ties was really where a lot of the action was, and so this is what got me starting to think about, well, maybe we should be doing social network interventions for them that aren't about connecting them to other street youth, but maybe it's about this, solidifying these connections that they have to other friends from home. And so that's how I got to this model. And this is just a standard logistic regression model. So the hard work really is in the data collection, and then in the step of data grooming, which is really this process of running this SAS code. And like I said, I'm happy to share that SAS code with folks. And if you're a Stata user, you just want to be thinking about kind of the equivalent logic to, okay, when I'm seeing repeated observations, I want to add, row 2 to row 1, and row 3 to the sum of rows 1 and 2, and on like that. You guys have questions about this?
Do you ever find it's useful to distinguish between the people who have very few social network ties and the ones who have much, much larger networks?
Yeah, sometimes it's really important, and sometimes it's not. So one of the things that I did in this network, in this analysis, was I also included the variable network size as a control variable. And what I found was that people who had larger networks had a slight reduction in their likelihood of reporting that they were a monogamous condom user. So it seems to suggest that these young people who are delineating bigger networks are involved in more risk or less healthy behaviors, which once I got looking at the sociometric data that I collected from these youth, started to make a lot of sense, because it was really these young people who had these bigger networks tended to have big street networks, and so they tended to be more embedded in a risk-taking context. And one of the things that we were really interested in and have found out more over time when we've been looking at these street-level networks is that the more interconnected you are to the streets, the worse off you tend to be doing, and the more that you're kind of staying away from those street networks and getting most of your social ties and support and influence from other places, the better you're doing. And I think that and so network size can be really important. It can be sort of an indicator of embeddedness. I mean, so for example, for you guys with your geriatric population in this housing situation, network size may be really important. I mean, people with bigger networks may be healthier. They may be doing much better than people with smaller networks. Or it could be that people with big networks are doing not as well because they're essentially connected to a lot of people who are doing things that aren't so good for them. So I often think that the most important thing is kind of characterizing not just the size of the network, but the size of the network with respect to something. So just raw size unto itself isn't necessarily predictive of a lot. And so I mean, you can look at even when you look at the odds ratios here. I mean, I don't know if those of you guys who spend much time with logistic regressions. I mean, if you get a 1, that essentially means nothing's happening. And if you've got a confidence interval that hovers around 1, you've got a 1 where not much of anything is happening. And so here we've got in this case, this thing it's basically 1, and the confidence interval is pretty tight around 1. This is basically 1, and it's pretty tight around 1. I mean, even though this is less than 1, it's still pretty close to 1. I mean, there's not a for each added person, you have an 8% reduction in your likelihood of reporting that you were a monogamous condom user. I mean, I don't know, I guess if you start compounding that by, going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, that might start to feel like it makes some difference, but just that one extra tie is a pretty small explanation of variance, whereas these variables where I took that proportion variable and then I recoded that proportion variable into the presence or absence, then suddenly you had it was creating a lot of differentiation amongst the populations. Like there are some of these young people who have a street peer who they perceive as a condom user, and that may actually be correlated with your own condom use, because young people tend to think that their friends do what they do. So it may not have anything to do with reality. It may just be that the condom users assume that their friends are also using condoms. That may be what that association is about. But likewise, even if this is just simply a mapping of my behavior onto my perceptions of my friend's behavior, this is kind of a nice way of thinking about the person who you are thinking about as your reference group is really important, right? I mean, this is kind of, as much as I bag on sociology, this is classic sociology stuff, right? So it doesn't just matter who social comparisons have a anchor, right? So I'm evaluating my behavior not in sort of a vacuum. I'm evaluating my behavior based on some reference group. And so for these young people who have these home-based connections, it seems like thinking about themselves, this is probably tapping into a cognitive process that is, I've got this person who's in my life, who's providing this influence, or who I attribute my own behaviors to them, but I'm thinking about that person as an important, relevant person. So I'm nominating them in my network. I'm talking to Eric about them doing these positive things that they may or may not be doing, but it's also, it may just be a marker for my own positive behaviors. But that's the person that they need to be comparing them to. Now, I didn't actually do all the social comparison stuff. This is just sort of after the fact, thinking about these data and trying to. I've been looking at these data for 5 or 6 years. And I'm thinking, what does this mean? I've had probably too much time to think about what does this mean. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is, this isn't just sort of an ecology of matching like people, but maybe there's some cognitive processes going on here as well. So,
is there a lot of work done in terms of, like, this is point in time data, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of comparing after either some kind of event or some kind of intervention and looking at the differences in networks over points in time?
There's relatively less, or a lot less, over time data. There's much more cross-sectional data, and there's much less intervention data as well. One really good example of the exception is the work of Carl Latkin at Johns Hopkins. He's done a lot of intervention work on HIV prevention among injection drug users in Baltimore. And so he's developed a peer-led intervention called SHIELD, where the point is training people who are former drug users to go out into the community and disseminate HIV prevention information around sex and injection drug use. And those studies, he's done a really nice job of getting people to describe their networks and then following them over time as they've participated in this intervention, seeing how their behaviors are changing. In some versions, in some iterations of the study, he's even had the outreach workers bring in 4 or 5 people from their networks that they're going to be targeting their intervention work toward, and then followed them over time and sort of seen if they've changed as well. There's relatively less work that's looked at changes over time. So I've got a couple of papers where I had some proxy measures of social networks. So I was asking young people, we were asking young people, how many of your friends are homeless? Some, a lot, none. How many of your friends are injection drug users? None, some, a lot, whatever. And in the context of that study, we were looking at over time as they were, if the proportions of those people changed, did you move into risky behaviors or out of risky behaviors? Did those changes, lead you back into housing situations or not? So we've done some work with that. Right now, I'm part of a newly funded grant where we're going to be looking at people entering permanent supportive housing, and so homeless people entering permanent supportive housing. And so and what we're looking at is we're getting a baseline network of people right as they're enrolling in the permanent supportive housing program, and then we're following them for 2 years in the permanent supportive housing program to see how their networks change and how that change in their networks may be facilitating HIV-oriented risk-taking. And preliminarily, we've got data on about 40 people that we did we just watched them for the first 3 months that they were in housing. And we've got some really interesting things that we're seeing. So one thing that we're seeing is there's for no person had a stable network. 0 people had a stable network. Almost everyone had the majority of their network change from time 1 to time 2. So in a sense, permanent supportive housing is an intervention. Like, we don't have a randomized control trial, so we don't have a comparison group, so we don't know if their networks would have been more stable if they just watched. So we're just watching this naturally occurring, intervention. But we are seeing a very large change in the in terms of the individuals who are nominated in that network. And like I was talking about before, we collect all this painstaking, detailed information about who these people are. And so we're seeing, like, yeah, John with the hatchet tattoo isn't here anymore. They don't want to talk about him. They're not talking to him this month. But what we're also seeing in terms of behaviors is two very interesting things. One is, in the aggregate, we're not seeing more people with more substance-using networks or more people with less substance-using networks. But what we're seeing on the individual level is a lot of movement in terms of substance-using networks. So some people, there's a large proportion of people who had a lot of substance users that now don't. And there's also a large proportion of people who didn't have a lot of substance users but now do. So on the aggregate, there's no movement, but on the individual level, there's a lot of movement. And then the really scary one is that sex risk behaviors go way up. And the reason is because you finally have a place to live. So you finally have a safe place, a private place to have sex. And once love comes into the picture, condoms go out the window. That's basically universal for all populations, right? The problem for homeless individuals, though, going into permanent supportive housing is that this person that they're falling in love with, who is this partner that they're bringing into their space, their safe private space where they're now having unprotected sex with, is someone who they met on the streets who is part of these high-risk networks. So you've got people who are engaging in very normative and very typical high-risk, in a sense, high-risk, no condom-using behaviors with their primary partners, but their primary partners are part of a population that's really high-risk. So you've got this sort of unexpected negative outcome, essentially, that we're seeing in this pilot data, which is that, and so essentially what we're saying is that even from this pilot data is, wow, we really have to start thinking about HIV prevention for these folks who are moving into permanent supportive housing, because mostly we were thinking about substance abuse treatment issues, keeping them in housing, mental health issues. I mean, there's so many problems that people moving into permanent supportive housing have, that whether or not they're using condoms is like way low on the list in terms of what we're thinking about, because we're not thinking about moving into permanent supportive housing as being actually something that is facilitative of risk, but it turns out that it is for a lot of people. So changes over time are really interesting, and they're much less studied because it's really hard to get this data. So, one of the best egocentric social network data studies on homeless youth is done by this group at RAND. And they did a random probability sample of homeless youth in Los Angeles. I mean, the effort they went to get this random sample of homeless youth is just Herculean. But because of how hard that is to collect data on homeless youth, they don't have any overtime data. They just did it once. They collected 400 great egocentric data, and then the literature is kind of bursting with their findings that they, over the last couple of years, from what they found in this study. But there's nothing over time. So, I mean, I'm right now writing a grant, literally this week, that's proposing looking at getting a sample, a smaller sample of homeless youth, and following them very closely for about 3 years over time, so we can actually wrangle them over 3 years, and doing, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff with them. It's not just going to be a social network survey, but we're really trying to kind of take these sorts of data and move them into that next space. But it's even egocentric network data is hard to collect. I mean, it takes a fairly long time to collect a really detailed social network survey. I mean, the social network survey that I'm presenting these data on takes, the total survey takes about an hour and a half. You've got about 45 minutes of a survey that's all of this sort of standard individual level, everything you want to know about the history of these homeless youth, and what are they sticking where, and what are they putting where, and all this other stuff. And then we're also then asking them about 20 minutes worth of a social network interview. And if they happen to be one of these young people who's got 50 ties, that 20-minute interview can sometimes become a 2-hour interview, because it just takes so long to ask them the descriptive information about all 50 of those people, that even if you're, the next 50 questions that we ask, or 60 questions that we ask, we can blast through in about 20 minutes. Which of these people, use meth? Oh, that person. But even still, as you get larger and larger networks, the participant burden kind of expands multiplicatively. even when you're trying to do these sort of techniques that I've been talking about asking the question of the whole network, that reduces the burden, but when you've got a bigger network, it just takes longer. So I don't know if that answers that question. That was too much of a tangent, but other thoughts? I'm thinking that maybe we should get some lunch. I don't know where that happens around here, so maybe one of you who does can steer me in the right direction. And what I'm thinking about so I guess the other question is, I could plow through for another maybe like 40 minutes, half an hour, and do the basic introduction to sociometric analysis, and then after lunch, as promised, we could get into whatever it is that you want to get into, or we could stop now, go eat, and then come back and do sociometric. What's the consensus? Who wants to eat? Raise your hand. Okay, people want to plow through. Okay, Jonathan maybe wants to eat. Okay,
I want to plow through, yeah.
So all right, so let's let me provide you with the overview of sociometric data. So I've already talked about some of the issues of data collection, but let me talk a little bit about more broadly how this is. So what you need to do when you're doing sociometric. So now frame shift here. Now we're not talking about one person's social circle. We're talking about thinking about some sort of population, some sort of universe of people that you're interested in, and thinking about their interconnections amongst one another. So in my case, what I was really interested in was these drop-in centers that become hubs of action for these street youth in terms of accessing services. This is where we're going to deliver prevention interventions from. This is where kids that are sleeping under bridges and kids that are in transitional living programs and kids that are couch surfing, they all come. This is where they sort of tend to have a touchstone with one another. So that's the universe that I was interested in. Maybe you're interested in everyone who lives in your housing project. Maybe you're interested in everyone who's in this room right now. You need to have some sort of boundary to define your population. And really, it tends to be relatively labor-intensive how you do this. And you really have 3 different approaches that you can take to the sampling strategy. One, the easiest one, is that you've got what's referred to as a positional approach. So you've got some sort of formal membership. So this is going to be every youth who's in this shelter who's registered on our shelter list tonight, or everyone who is a resident of our project. Okay, that's great. Everyone's in a classroom. Another one is this relational approach. So probably all of you guys have heard of RDS thrown around, respondent-driven sampling. So with that, what you do is you select some population that you're interested in, and you also then select some relationship that you're interested in. So for example, it could be injection drug users who share drugs or works with one another. Okay, so what you then do is you collect a seed person, and you ask that seed person to bring to you 3 or 5, typically, people who they do that behavior that you're interested in. So bring me 3 sex partners, bring me 3 people that you use drugs with, bring me 3 friends, however you're defining that time. And then that next person, you ask them the same thing. Bring me 3 other people who you are who you're friends with, or that you have sex with, or that you use drugs with. And you expand out until you get to the sample size that you want. And you keep careful track of who led you to where, so you can try to calculate some sort of biases based on some characteristics of people. So you might find out that, we have a lot of people who seem to be coming through this one network of people that is white, and they're migratory homeless youth who are these very unstable kids, but they ended up being this sort of like this branched out into this really big network of these other traveling kids, and so we need to be thinking about like, well, in general, maybe we've got 50% of our population made up of those kinds of 50% of our sample, but in our population surveys that we do, we only see 10% of them. So we need to sort of start to deal with the biases that creates. All right, that's one thing. I don't really like those methods very much. I'm not a big fan. I think that they've got too many biases. I think that the math modeling promises of reducing bias by keeping careful track of where you're going are a little bit overstated. I've had too many colleagues who've done this method and felt like they got kind of burned by it. I haven't done it myself because of those things, but I mean, it's out there.
Burned out.
What's that?
Burned out.
Burned out. They felt like they were going to get a very representative, unbiased sample, and in the end they felt like they got something that was a very skewed convenience sample that really gave them, that really, you know, in truth, the respondent-driven sampling is a snowball sampling. You're just keeping track of how that snowball happened. So you can still end up with a really biased sample. I mean, you know, we all learned in like Research Methods 101 that snowball samples give you biased results, and usually the problem is that we don't even know how they're biased. I mean, at least now you know how they're biased, but you invest this enormous amount of resources and you end up with this sample that you feel like you can't really do much with. Or at least that it's so biased that you feel like every paper you write, you're saying, well, you know, our representatives, you know, you have to have some sort of benchmark population against which you're trying to create the representative sample, and then that creates sample weights for you. And so you can end up collecting 4,000 surveys and have an analytic sample weighted size of 500. And so they feel like, oh my God, we spent like, you know, several $100,000 and we've got this data set that doesn't have much power. That's the way that they were feeling burned. That doesn't always happen, it shouldn't always happen, but you know, things go screwy in the real world. Event-based approach. So this is the one that I've been using a lot of. So this is really, essentially, you know, you've got an unbounded population, so you don't really have a roster of some kind, so you create an artificial roster, or you create some sort of way of defining a boundary. So, you know, with me, with the homeless youth, these are truly open systems. You know, you can come and go as a homeless youth. You get kicked out one night, you run away one night, you enter into the system, you travel back to Austin the next day. I mean, it's a very fluid state of affairs. But I still want a sociometric thing because I know from having spent enough time in the community for years working with these young people that, you know, there's network processes going on here. Like there is a group of kids for a period of time in these social spaces that happen. So what I do is I define that boundary by saying everyone who comes into this drop-in center for a month is part of this network, at least in a loose sense, and I'm going to sample all of them. I'm going to ask every single one of them to participate in the survey, and I usually get like 80 to 90% of them to say yes, and then I'm going to figure out how they're all interconnected to one another. And so, and I ask them for that month that I'm there interviewing, I also tag the time frame about their interactions to that previous month, so that we're essentially looking at the ongoing ties that are going on for that month. This got developed by this guy, Lynn Freeman, who I was mentioning earlier. Lynn Freeman, he did this sampling procedure with a beach. So people used to refer to it as like the beach method. So I mean, it was like what he did was he lived in Irvine, which is in Orange County, and so he was trying to figure out who the regulars on this beach community that he would go to were. So he essentially went to the same stretch of beach every day, and he looked to see, you know, how many people came at least 3 times during the month that he was there, and he interviewed all of those people, and he talked, and he was able to construct this network of the regulars who were at this beach. And so this is kind of my homeless youth version of this. And really my thinking about this as being good for unbounded populations is because with what you get with, and now I'll go to this next slide. I'll go to this example for a second. When you look at this network, one of the reasons that I don't, so the positional approach, like a roster, doesn't make any sense because like these drop-in centers or like meal lines, you know, you don't sign in for them, you just show up. You know, there's no formal membership, so that's out the window. And in fact, that's partly why a lot of homeless individuals will use these things because they don't trust systems, they don't want to sign up for anything, so that's, you know, not going to work. The respondent-driven sampling I worry about too because of all these folks. So one of the things that I had observed in my because I spent, I don't know, about 2 or 3 years where I would volunteer for 1 full day a week, every day at this one drop-in center just to sort of be immersed in the community, to kind of become a proper community-based researcher because I was originally trained as a sociologist and I wanted to become a community-based researcher. So, and what I noticed is that there are a lot of these young people who would come in every single day and they didn't talk to anyone except for the staff. And they were the ones who seemed to be doing really well. And I thought, this RDS thing is going to be garbage because none of these guys have relationships with the rest of the youth in this space, and yet they're really important because they seem to be the ones who are moving forward in this process. And so I felt like the responder-driven sampling, if I was like, well, who's someone who's your friend, or who's someone that you use drugs with, like, I was going to miss all these guys. And all these guys, I think, are actually really, really different and interesting and important than these guys, and I want them in my population, and I want to understand that they are isolates within this network is something very important. And so that's why I sort of settled on what seems like kind of maybe a half-assed sampling technique, which is I'm going to go to this place and I'm going to say, for this period of time, I'm going to talk to everybody. You know, and so it's really fun that when I got this grant, somebody asked me, like, oh, so, you got this new grant, this R01, congratulations, good for you. What's it about? I was like, well, part of it is that I've developed this, new kind of, field method collection technique. Like, oh, what is it about? I'm like, I go someplace for a period of time and I talk to everybody. That's really underwhelming. It's like, I know, it's really underwhelming, but it's really important. And it really, a lot of the technique was the complicated, like that matching stuff. And that's where the pager for what I was doing was coming in. That's where the because then how do you, from these people who may not even know everyone's full information, right? So I'm going to talk about Patches. That's all I know him by. Like, I've known him for a week, but he's somebody who's important because I'm doing drugs with him, And so, but then, how do we get to the right Patches? And we go back to my conversation from earlier. You had a question?
Yeah, so conceptually, this is very different in a lot of ways from the egocentric. And that's
Very
because like, if you did an egocentric analysis of all these people on the left,
Mm-hmm.
they could look very connected, but in this
And they
picture,
usually do.
Okay.
And they
And
usually
in this
do.
picture, they look isolated because of what you're mapping here is just the connections within this universe.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So in your context with the housing, you could do exactly the same thing. So you could be looking at what are the egocentric ties your people have. And so some people might be really integrated because they have a lot of connections to family who are living down the street or living, in the Bronx or whatever. You could also have a lot of people who are interconnected with other people in the housing project. And so you may, and this gets back to Angela's question earlier, which is, well, did your student look at the egocentric or the sociometric or both? And I was saying, for her, she's one of the few people who's really starting to say, we really need to be looking at both of these things simultaneously because these young people, they're isolates with respect to this network, but they're highly interconnected to other networks that are really important. So how do we model these things? And so one of the ways that she was thinking about it was that there is a network that all of these young people share, which is this street-based, drop-in center focused network. And so understanding how they relate to that network is important for us to understand. But then each one of them has their own universe unto themselves that is also important. And we want to characterize that, and we need to be looking at those two things kind of controlling for one another. And because we're looking at, in her case, she was looking at individual level outcomes, she was creating data that was based on the egocentric network stuff, like I was showing you earlier, and also then we're going to show you now moving forward, that was based on these sorts of data. So one of the things that you can do, and after lunch we'll pull out the program and we'll play, is that you can create different visualizations of the network. And it may help you to think about the network in different ways. So I showed you that one network, which is using a technique called a spring embedder. And the spring embedder, basically what it does is it throws together people who have shared experience, who have shared ties, get pulled closer together, and people who have fewer ties in common are pushed further apart. That's how the algorithm works. And so what you can see here is someone like this guy out here who only has one tie to a person, who only has one tie to another person, who only has one tie to another person to get into this small role, he or she gets pushed way out, versus these people who have several ties bringing them together in this kind of dense, knotted mass in the middle. That might be a useful way for you to look at the network because it's going to sort of show you centralization. Who's in the middle, who's not in the middle, who's popular, who's not. Sometimes we're really more interested in kind of trying to assess from a bird's eye perspective how densely a network is connected. So there was a paper in AJPH that came out maybe about a year and a half ago where they were looking at patient sharing amongst different hospitals. And in that paper, they used this kind of visualization because what they were doing is they were using different cutoff values. So they were saying, well, how connected are these hospitals in it's like San Diego-based hospitals. So it's like, how connected are these hospitals in San Diego if we look at a minimum of one person? And it was like, boom, this like super dense network, right? And every hospital is connected because if you just limit it to one person, there's almost a total overlap. If you then did it to 10 people, it got sparser. If you did it by 100 people, it got much sparser. And then 1,000 people, it was almost nothing at all. So you got this real sense of, well, when we're thinking about how interconnected are these hospitals with respect to their patient sharing, there's really sort of thresholds that we might want to be thinking about. And so what they were really trying to show is maybe, how do we define this? And they were using these sorts of visualizations that get you the density you can see better. So that might be useful for you. Another thing that I find to be really useful, and I'll share how to do this with you guys in a minute, is you can group things by attributes. So in these data, what I have is the red dots are people who are using condoms the last time they had sex. And the gray dots are people who weren't using, red dots are people who were not using condoms. The gray dots are people who were using condoms. And one of the things that I was interested in just, casually was I was trying to think about, well, how much crossover between these two groups is there? And so if you ask the program to line up group all the people with one characteristic on one side of the page and all the people with another characteristic on the other side of your page, you can then see the density of the crossover. So here you can see that, wow, it's really interesting. Like almost everybody who is a condom user is connected to someone who's not a condom user. So this sort of simplistic idea of, everybody does like everybody else does might not be playing out in these data with respect to this behavior so much. So in this example, what I really ended up being interested in was, going back to this diagram, was thinking about, so initially what I was thinking about was sort of the most basic analysis that people often do with these sociometric data, at least when they're doing statistical models of behaviors, is that they will look at, do you do something if you're connected to more people in your network in this network that do this thing? And they may even define it more complexly than just direct ties. They may look at ties that are 2 steps away, 3 steps away, 4 steps away, etc. There's a great book by this guy, Christakis and Fowler, called Connected, that talks about how it's really a theorizing and talking about the way that indirect ties influence our behaviors, and so modeling not just the direct ties which you get with egocentric data, but moving to those 2-step ties, 3-step ties, 4-step ties, and once you get past about 3 steps away from you, people stop being very influential on your behavior for most behaviors. So there's interesting stuff that goes on. So I was initially interested in that. But as I started looking at this map, I started thinking, wow, what's really interesting to me here is that, we know that you're going to do something, and this is the paper that I sent you guys. So I had this conceptual diagram where I had those 4 different positive conceptual pieces about how a network could be laid out. So did everyone get a chance to see it at least? Yes, no? Do you want me to try to, who wants to see the picture? Can you try to pull up the picture? No, okay. So, so basically, if you're connected to, if people tend to be connected to other people that are risk-taking, okay, what does that look like structurally? Do we have a bunch of small little clusters where people are connected to just like 3 or 4 people? We do want to see it? Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought the answer was no. I will happily pull up the diagram to show you this conceptual example. Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, so I can pass it around?
Sure, yeah, just pass it around.
It might be faster.
Yeah, I think it
You never know.
probably than me trying to find it and pull up the right page.
The problem is you can't multi-screen on this screen.
I know, it's
very frustrating.
It is. So, do we want to be, are people connected in these small little clusters? And so there's, groups of 3 or 4 people that are risk-taking, maybe groups of 3 or 4 people that are not connected to them that are not risk-taking. Do we have long, sprawling chains of people? So like, everybody's connected to 2 or 3 people who's connected to 2 or 3 people who's connected to 2 or 3 people who's connected to 2 or 3 people. And when we think about homeless youth, that depiction is kind of, I think, what people have been thinking is going on. It's like there's not a lot of community amongst homeless youth. It's really that everybody's got a couple of friends, and those couple of friends might be attached to another person who's got a couple of friends. Or we could have this sort of core periphery structure where we've got a big small world like Stanley Milgram was talking about, and we might have some people that are more important in that world and other people who are less important in that world. And so it turns out that that's what homeless youth look like. Then once you get into that kind of picture, you can then think about, well, what is structurally driving things? And one of the issues that I got really interested in, even just looking at this, was I thought, wow, these young people who are isolated, and also these young people who seem to be on the edge of this network, these gray dots on the edge. There's a lot of gray dots that are on the periphery. It seems like there's a lot of red dots toward the core. So what I started to then think about was, well, okay, Eric, how do we model that? So how do we model that?
Get a clarification.
Yeah, sure.
They're on the periphery in terms of, in this particular one, methamphetamine use? Or
This is condom use. So this is, or failure to use condoms. So these are unprotected sex behaviors. The other diagram that I was showing you was from the same network, and it was methamphetamine use. So there's a lot of overlap between not using condoms and using meth.
So let's say, just for an example, sites where they might get food, this might be very different, right, in terms of...
Well, this is the site where they get food. So,
okay, so
but I guess the way bringing on the periphery is how do they get to other people? It's not specialized. The color of the dots is a particular attribute, but the shape of the network is whether they're in the periphery or not.
How connected
so the
are
people
they?
on the low things, they don't have.
Right. So
ties are different.
No, but I guess what
Okay.
what I'm trying to understand is this is the relations around a particular issue, not necessarily the relation.
I understand your question. The ties on this network diagram are the nominations of these youth to one another when I was asking them, who do you interact with in the last month? So this is when I asked that initial question, who do you interact with in the last month? Who's in your social network? And then I asked all this extensive information about their describing those characteristics of those people. So what's their age, what's their race, what's their name, what's their street name, what tattoos do they have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is how I created the lines that exist between these people. So this person talked only about this person. This person talked about that person and this person. That's what the arrowheads mean.
Okay.
This person talked about that person and also talked about that person. This person talked about that person. This person talked about that person. This person talked about that person. And then the red color here indicates which of those people were using condoms. And that I derived from the survey data. So I asked everyone in the individual survey, okay, the last time you had sex, did you use any birth control methods? And if you did, what were they? And did you use a condom? And so then they told me whether they used condoms or not. So what this diagram represents is the social ties between people and then their individual level risk taking. So what I'm trying to understand here is there something about the ecology of this social system that may be conducive to risk or resilient behaviors? So this isn't a sex network. So this isn't, these two people hooked up. These two people are friends, and we're trying to see if they are...
I guess what I'm trying to understand is how did you populate all of the because if they're not connected to anybody, how did you populate them?
So these people are people who came into the drop-in center during that
Okay,
moment,
from the invite.
and we interviewed them, and we asked them to delineate their network. And of the 15 or so people that they told us about, not a single person on their list was another young person who was a part of that population. So the way that we defined the population was we interviewed every single young person who came in for that month. So this first time that I did it, we did a shorter data collection. It was more about 2 weeks. So we did 136 youth that we got. Then what we did was we, after the fact, went back, or after we were done with the data collection, we then went through line by line every single person nominated and said, okay, so Eric is talking about Carla and Brian and his mom. Okay, mom definitely not. You know, Bill, who he knows from college, you know, definitely not. And then if maybe Carla is somebody, oh, we have a Carla in our data set. Let's try to figure out if that's not Carla. So then we go and we look, okay, oh yes, we did interview a Carla. Yes, okay, so Carla's part of the population, great. Is it the same Carla? Oh no, Eric's talking about a white Carla who's about 22. This is an African American Carla who's 16. Not the same Carla, never mind. And we would follow this procedure until we got this universe of people talking about one another. And what I found, and this was sort of based on you know, corresponded to my field observation, was that about 25 to 30% of the young people who came into these drop-in centers to access food, clothing, and case management services had nothing to do with one another. They stayed completely away from one another. You could watch them casually run into one another and be like, hey Bill, how's it going? Because I mean, they're not going to, you know, if you disrespect people on the streets, it's a good way to get your ass kicked. But you don't find them talking about them as a meaningful social interaction because they didn't spend any time talking. They didn't interact with them. All they did was say hi. You know, they won't characterize that as an interaction, even though in a strict sense you might characterize it as an interaction. So that's how we ended up with these people who are isolates. So these people usually end up having 10, 15 people that they nominate, but they're people who aren't in this universe of street youth. So this doesn't include anybody, you know, this person might have a connection to their mom, they might have a connection to the case manager, they might have a connection to some sort of volunteer like me. It was always weird to see myself pop up in people's networks every once in a while. So, I mean, you know, but you wouldn't see, them connected to the rest of this world. And so one of the things that I was trying to do with this work initially was I thought, you know, there's something going on about these guys. I'm not quite sure what's going on about them, but they're different. You know, and they're structurally they're very different. They're staying away from these other young people, and I wanted to characterize them, and I wanted to see if maybe behaviorally they were also different, because I definitely noticed that there was this group of young people who were, it seemed to me, were doing better, that were interacting with the staff. But then I was thinking, well, maybe it's just that they, you know, they've got positive affect with the staff, and so they're interacting with them a lot, and they're not actually really doing any better. It's just that, you know, we hear more of their stories because they're actually interacting with the staff a lot more. But as we started to do this, it started to seem like, no, there really is something going on here with the engagement with social services. So
yeah, that's because I'm just thinking, that's why I'm asking, because oftentimes they know of Joe or, you know, Patches. It's not necessarily a personal relationship, but everybody knows Patches, who does. He's the hookup for blah blah blah.
Right, and the thing is, you know, you want to be careful to not ask youth. I think, to me, with this population, I think the question of who do you know is a relatively less important question than who are you interacting with, who's in your social network, and then providing them with those prompts that kind of give some example social ties that are sort of more meaningful relationships. Because, you know, that you know of Patches doesn't really matter too much to me. I mean, if he's just like some guy that you're aware of, I mean, I know who Patches is too. I'm not going to go, you know, use meth after work. You know, I mean, so it doesn't matter that I know Patches and that I know Patches is the meth hookup. You know, or Hawkins. So some things that you can think about as usual suspects for position issues. So one of the things that you might be very interested in is trying to understand where in that network people are, and then does where those people are in that network have an impact on what they do. So there's a few different concepts. One is degree centrality. This is simply the number of people who you're connected to. So how many people are you connected? Are you directly connected to? Another issue is betweenness. Betweenness is the notion that you exist between two people. So this is a count of how many people need to go through you in order to be connected to one another. Okay? So, for example, in a universe in which you and I know one another, and you guys know one another, but you and I don't know one another, you have one pair that you're connecting. And so sometimes this can also be a really important characteristic of people, that they're bridging a lot of spaces. So they're not necessarily very popular, but you may be very instrumental. Because you can also think about the fact that, and I'll show you with the network itself, this guy doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot because he's only got 2 people that he's connected to. However, this person is also along a lot of paths that get really stringy. So this person has a higher betweenness score. Now this person also has both a really high degree score and a really high betweenness score. There's a lot of people that, there's a lot of pairs that cross through him or her, and also he has, or he or she has a lot of people that they're connected to as well.
I think this is a good question. Is there a reason why these guys on the bottom, is there a reason why those arrows cross over?
Oh,
Or is it just kind of...
Unfortunately, this program, if you just ask it to spit this out, it kind of gives you some messy overlaps every once in a while. And all of these diagrams tend to be somewhat arbitrary. So you could use an algorithm to place them, but there's not necessarily, I'm not going to then take a ruler and look at social distance as measured on this map in any way, right? So usually what I do is when I do my publications, is I clean this up and put this as another arrow line over here, and I get rid of these crossovers because the crossovers confuse things, because the crossovers give you the false impression that you've got a lot of this going on, when in fact this is 2 small networks, not one medium-sized network, if that makes sense. So a couple of other concepts is eigenvector centrality. This is essentially using the entire matrix of ties. So it's using some matrix algebra. And what it does is it allows you to weight your personal centrality. So instead of just the degree, like how many people am I connected to, it weights it by how many people your connections are connected to, and those connections are connected to, and those connections are connected to. So it gives you a sense of how much you are at the heart of the interconnections in this network, which can sometimes be more meaningful than just the raw number, because you can look at a network like this and you could say, okay, here's someone who only has 3 ties to other people. Well, we also have another person, over here who only has 3 ties to other people. But this person is connected to people who are 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 connected to people. Whereas this person is connected to someone who's 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 connected to someone. And so you want to be able to differentiate between someone like this, who is different than someone like this, even though the absolute number of direct ties that they have is exactly the same. It's 4 in both cases. This person's eigenvector centrality is much higher because they're much closer to where all the action is, whereas this person's further from the action. And then the last thing, and this is actually one of my favorites, is the K-core. It's a little bit wonky maybe, but it's a sub-network within the network where people are connected to a K number of minimum of other people, and everyone in that subnetwork is connected to K minimum of other people. So this is a way of it's probably the most simplistic way of measuring cohesion. So you can look at cohesive subgroups. And so what that's looking at, these cohesive subgroups, is it's trying to say, okay, there's a space here where we've got people who are connected to at least 5 other people. And everyone in that space is connected to at least 5 other people. And there's this space where there's this sort of bare minimum amount of cohesion going on. And that can be a way of defining a core of action versus a periphery of action. And so in the paper that I shared with you, what I did very simply was I used some very nice features of this program, and I'll show you guys how to do this after lunch. But basically, very simply, you could say, calculate the K-core of each individual. Like, what core do they belong to? And you get a score. And so, with that score, you can then, when you look here, one of the things you get is this K-core score. So, in this particular network, the maximum K-coreness was 7. There was actually there's actually a group of young people who had a minimum number of 7 ties to one another in this space. And there's actually more than 7 of them that have that 7. You would have to have a bare minimum of 7 in order to have a K-core of 7, but you can have 10 people in a K-core of 7 or 25 people in a K-core of 7. It just may be that 7 is kind of where it maxes out in terms of that overlapping issue. Then we also have some people that are zeros. So zeros basically mean that you're an isolate, and 1s, and that means that you're in a space where you're only connected to one other person. And then, so in this case, what I did was I looked across sort of a spectrum of different cut points because I wasn't quite sure where the core and where the periphery was. I wasn't sure if it was a 7 versus 6 versus everybody else, or if it was 5 through 6 versus everybody else, or if it was 0 and 1 versus everybody else. I was trying to kind of get a sense of where is this going. And so what I did initially was I just sort of said, well, give me the K-cores. Like, tell me where these K-cores are. And so one of the things it can do is it can give you the colors. And so here you get some color variation of this. And so what I saw was that the black dots were those zeros. I mean, that one was obvious to me. And then we had these pink dots that were the 1s. And so I started to say, oh, okay, maybe this is how I'm starting to define this periphery. Because it looks like maybe the zeros and the 1s seem to be sort of this peripheral space. Because we also have a bunch of, you can see that we also have a bunch of these pink guys that are sort of the hangers-on of this space as well. And I kind of kept flipping back and forth between the map of where the risk behavior was and the map of the K-core, trying to see like, okay, is there a threshold where things seem to get kind of dense enough that it seems to start to capture that, what I saw as that visual observation initially that was, oh, it seems like this is happening in the middle. So I was trying to get a sense of like, well, where's the threshold of how can I define that middle? So then once I did, what's nice about these programs is that they will generate for you a lot of individual level characteristics and data points for each person that's related to their position. So once you've gone through this awful, 3-month process of having your research assistants painstakingly figure out, the Damians and the patches and stuff like this, you then me get the really nice, easy job of just being like, oh, clickety click, 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 and then you just see like all this great information, and you run your stats models, and you're really happy. So this part's the easy part, and so what you're doing here is you're getting it to create new variables. You're getting the program, either use CINet or NetDraw, to create more variables for you. So in this case, this K-core variable is something that it creates very quickly. It's a drop-down menu. You ask it to give you the K-cores. It spits it out. You then cut and paste this column of data. Make sure you keep your PIDs in place. You merge it back with your data set, and off you go and you run your stats models. I mean, it's really that easy. And I think really what becomes, for us, the most difficult thing is collecting the data. And the second most difficult thing is really slogging through conceptually, what is it that you're trying to find out about this network? Are you trying to find out, are you theoretically interested in the prominence of individuals? Are you theoretically interested in cohesive subgroups? Are you theoretically interested in people that bridge social spaces? Are you theoretically interested in people who are clustering in sort of those small little component networks where it's like those 2 or 3 people that are off to themselves? Is that the thing that you're interested in? And you really have to be thinking about your social context and what you're interested in. So one of the things that Anamika, my PhD student I'm so proud of, has been doing with her work is she's been looking at norms around substance using. So she's been looking at who these young people perceive to be in these large networks, who they're perceiving to be using meth and approving or disapproving of their use of meth, and how are those behaviors and how are those perceptions maybe clustering, so that she can kind of actually characterize not just the survey measure of I have this norm, but also is there an ecology to those norms? And what she's finding is she was really interested in what's more important, popularity or cohesion in terms of norms? Because you could have this notion from intervention models that, oh, let's find the most popular person or popular people. We'll train them to be our outreach workers. We'll have them go and use their popularity and change everybody's minds. That would be a great idea. Or you could say, maybe individual level popularity isn't as important as trying to figure out where are there pockets of people with lots of interconnections to one another. And so any one person may not be particularly popular, but there's sort of a redundancy of ties that's sort of forming norms. And so we need to kind of figure out where those pockets are so we can infect each one of those pockets. And what she was finding was that it seems to be the latter, that being really popular doesn't seem to be that important for these norms. Like you can have really popular kids who have tons of ties but don't really have or adhere to the same perceptions of norms of other people. But it's really, and maybe sensibly, that norms are a part of the sort of redundancy. It's like you and I are connected, and you are connected, and you're connected, and we're connected. And when you start to get those, even if it's only 3 or 4 of us in a little bit of a region, but we're all thinking the same way, we're all reinforcing that with one another, more so than like someone like me. It's like, I'm going to tell you all about my ideas, and you guys are all listening to me today, and I'm going to diffuse all these ideas to you. No, that's not as important as the fact that you all are going to go talk to each other for the next 2 months, and reinforce these ideas. So, so you can look at that by looking at sort of the distinction between is K-core where you're doing, because that's going to give you those cohesive regions, or is it the degree centrality, which is just going to be like the raw popularity of someone. Or you could even be doing, like one of my other students is doing right now, she's looking at violence in networks, and she's really interested in the reach of violence. And so what she's finding is that it's not just that your raw popularity, again, doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you're engaged in sort of in violence as part of your conflict resolution strategies. It's that people who have, the most popular people from a raw sense aren't necessarily more involved in violence, but it's people who are connected to people who are connected to people who are connected to people. It's that eigenvector thing. So it's the people that are in those pockets where things are being reinforced and you're more densely part of this larger structure. Those are the people that are being sucked into it. So it's kind of like this idea that people who are, it's not just that you're connected to this network, but you're deeply connected to people who are deeply connected to people who are deeply connected to people who are deeply connected to people. That's what sucks you into violence. So and which is kind of interesting when you're thinking about intervention programs and you're thinking about, well, what are we trying to intervene with a network, and who are we trying to pick to be our intervention agents in a network? It may not always be an intuitive solution, and so that's kind of the fun stuff that I spent time with. So I'll leave us there, and let's stop and have some lunch, and then afterwards we'll talk about what you guys want to know more about, and I'll get into the nit and grit of whatever it is that you guys want to do. So. Thanks for hanging in there with me for like 4 solid hours. No worries.
Impressive.
I always teach 3-hour classes, so it's only a little bit longer.
Impressive too, so it's a little bit less than
That sounds luxurious. But,
it's frustrating sometimes.
you can't quite get into it. Yeah, I could see that.
Looks like she ready to
Yeah,
Hi.
I didn't know what your plans are for lunch.
I don't have any.
Yeah?
So if you,
Yeah.
I know you have lunch plans.
Yeah.
You can include
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Yes.
that.
Yes, back there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the lock is here, or if you want
You
to
know
bring
what? I'll
your
take
stuff
I'll
up
take my
to my
computer.
office.
That would
Yeah.
be perfect.
Yeah.
Too
bad,
Right,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, let's come back, I mean, what, do you think an hour is good? So should we try to come back here like a little bit before 2? Does that make sense? Because I just want to, I know I don't want it to go too late into the afternoon, but I figure we can kind of do some pointed, what do you guys want to know about stuff for a couple of hours, and as it peters out, we'll stop, and if you, and yeah. We'll see how many of you return.
Do you want me to have the room locked up?
It doesn't matter to me if it's locked, I'm going to take my bag.
You're going to take it, okay.
Thank you.
I actually put it there with myself.
I was just gonna say,
Hey,
it's
oh.
a little young
That
girl.
sounds good. It might be just,
No one else has rights to,
get rid of I'm sure I'm not leaving anything that I'm gonna be sad.
Should we pause it?
Sure. I'll have the guys come back up. I think we should be almost done. In fact, we'll let them, how are we doing on there?
Yeah, I'm really sad that gets cut.
Okay.
An hour 31.
I'll let them, come up and get it, actually. I'm gonna give them a call. Where are folks going to eat?
Well, no, I was just saying, should it be paused?
I think he's, yeah, let's pause it, right? Sure, go ahead, give it a pause.
Well, you're the one who knows which button it is.
Oh, well, then I'm gonna call him just in case.
Oh,
Let's see
okay.
that.
That's pathetic.
God forbid. Well, you
You're the
never
one-
know. I
This is where I go, right? That's the way.
Yeah, it's kind of just.
Probably gonna cut out Friday.
I'm already. There is a little cafe on the ground floor, yes, if you wanted to go there. There's a deli across, there's a lot. At least you can sit there and eat. I mean, you're certainly welcome to bring something back up here if you'd like, or when you first come in the doors, there's those stairs, they're like, weird, they're like so open. If you walk up those stairs, there's like a little lounge right there that you can bring something back. If you want to like, a different environment. There's a few choices. That deli across the street pretty much just does sandwiches and stuff like that. Very expensive. Downstairs.
There's a new place still there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's there's a certain.
Well, because I need to be here by 8:30. That's why.
This is really, so there's a lot, it's.
Yeah, and he seems really responsive, like if you want to.
Hi, it's Linda, in room 322. And they are done with the video. If you want, what should I do with it? What would I do with the video camera?
St. Francis, you said?
Yeah.
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 Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
You have that 10 code, value code, am I correct, or am I thinking of somebody else? Because I remember very